A young woman makes one phone call on a rainy night, not to the police, not to the hospital, but to the most dangerous man in the city. The man she once loved, once ran away from, and once swore never to return. But as blood mixes with the rainwater in the dark parking lot, she realizes only the devil can save her from hell. Tonight's story will change everything. Watch until the end, hit like, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight, the kind of rain that didn't clean anything but just moved the filth around. It hammered the flat roof of Blackwater Diner like 1,000 dull fists, pooling in the cracked gutters and spilling down the grease-streaked windows in sheets thick enough to blur the neon sign outside. The sign buzzed and flickered, half the letters dead, casting a sick pink glow across the empty parking lot. Inside, Morel Vane dragged a wet rag across the last booth. Her knuckles were raw. Her lower back ached from 10 hours on her feet, and the smell of burnt coffee and old bacon grease had soaked so deep into her uniform she couldn't tell where the diner ended and she began. 26 years old, 2 jobs, 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Fenwick Street, a life measured in tip jars and bus schedules. She was nobody. That was the point. The diner was supposed to be empty. Last customer left around midnight, a truck driver who paid an exact change and didn't look up from his phone. Morel had already counted the register, wiped the counters twice, and was running through the closing checklist in her head when she noticed the man in booth 9. He sat perfectly still. Charcoal coat draped across his shoulders like armor. A cup of black coffee in front of him, untouched. The surface long gone cold. He wasn't reading, wasn't on his phone. He was watching the storm through the window the way some men watch a fire, with patience and ownership and something that looked almost like hunger. Morel's hands stopped moving. Her stomach dropped 3 inches. She knew that profile. The hard jaw. The scar that started behind his left ear and disappeared beneath his collar. The way he held his shoulders. Not relaxed, never relaxed, but coiled, like a man who had trained his body to explode from stillness in a fraction of a second. Caius Vale. The name hit her bloodstream like ice water. Harbor City had a lot of dangerous men. Dock workers with prison records, crooked cops who shook down corner stores, gang runners who shot each other over territory lines drawn in spray paint. But Caius Vale operated on a different plane entirely. He was the gravity that held the city's underworld in orbit. Newspapers called him the Ghost King, a name that stuck because nobody could ever prove he existed in the places where the worst things happened. Prosecutors built cases against his lieutenants, never him. Witnesses recanted. Evidence vanished. Entire investigations collapsed like houses built on sand. And 7 years ago, before any of that mattered, he had been hers. Or she had been his. She was never sure which. Morel turned away from booth 9 and kept wiping. Her heart was hammering, but her hands stayed steady. That was a skill she'd developed, the ability to keep her body functioning while her mind screamed. She'd learned it during 2 years with Denton. She'd perfected it during the 3 months of Caius. She didn't look at him again. He didn't speak. The clock above the register ticked past 1:45 a.m. Morel finished the closing checklist mechanically. Locked the kitchen. Turned off the fryers. Checked the back door twice. The whole time she could feel him there, not watching her exactly, but aware of her the way a predator is aware of movement at the edge of its vision. It wasn't threatening. It was worse than threatening. It was familiar. She pulled on her jacket, a thin denim thing that did nothing against the cold, grabbed her bag, and walked toward the front door without stopping at booth 9. Her sneakers squeaked on the wet tile. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed it open, and the rain hit her face like a slap. The parking lot was almost completely dark. One streetlight at the far end, buzzing and dim. Her sedan sat alone near the dumpsters, a 12-year-old Honda with a cracked windshield and a passenger door that didn't lock. She'd parked there because the owner told her to keep the good spots open for customers. As if Blackwater Diner had customers fighting over parking at 2 in the morning. Morel walked fast, keys already in her fist the way her mother taught her. Rain soaked through her jacket in seconds. Her breath came out in thin white clouds that the wind tore apart. She was 15 feet from her car when she heard the footstep. Not behind her. To her left. Between the dumpster and the delivery van that had been parked there since Tuesday. A shape separated from the darkness. Hey, Morel. The voice hit her like a fist to the chest, low, thick with alcohol, vibrating with the specific kind of rage that only comes from a man who has spent hours drinking himself into certainty that someone else is responsible for every miserable thing in his life. Denton Rourke stepped into the pale wash of the streetlight. He looked worse than the last time she'd seen him, which had been across a courtroom 8 months ago when she'd sat in a wooden chair and told a judge exactly what his fists felt like against her ribs. He'd lost weight in the wrong way. His cheeks were hollowed out, his eyes sunken and glassy. A patchy beard covered the jaw she used to think was handsome back when she was 22, and stupid enough to believe that intensity was the same thing as love. "Don't," Morel said. Just the one word. Flat. Final. "Don't what?" Denton moved closer. His boots scraped the wet asphalt. "Don't talk to you? Don't exist? That what you want?" "I want you to stay away from me. There's a restraining order. A piece of paper." He spat the words. "You think a piece of paper means anything? You destroyed my life, Morel. You sat up there in that courtroom and you lied." "I didn't lie. And now I can't get to work. I can't rent. I can't do anything because you decided to play victim." "I was the victim, Denton." He lunged. It happened so fast that her brain didn't process it as movement, just a sudden compression of space, and then his hand was around her upper arm, fingers digging into muscle, and he was swinging her sideways. Her hip hit the hood of her car with a crack that sent pain shooting up through her spine. Her keys flew out of her hand and skittered across the pavement. "You were never a victim," he hissed, his face inches from hers. She could smell the whiskey and the cigarettes, and underneath it something sour, something rotting. "You were a liar who couldn't handle a real relationship." Morel's free hand came up fast, fingers hooked, aiming for his eyes. She caught his cheek instead, dragging 4 lines of red across his skin. He recoiled, more from surprise than pain, and she used the half-second to twist sideways and pull free. She ran. 3 steps. That's all she got. His hand caught the back of her jacket and yanked. The denim ripped at the shoulder seam as she went down, her knees hitting the concrete hard enough to tear through her jeans. Rainwater splashed into her eyes. She tasted blood. She'd bitten her tongue on impact. Denton grabbed her by the hair and pulled her up to her knees. "You don't get to run from me," he said. His voice had gone quiet now. That was worse. The quiet voice was always worse. "You don't get to ruin someone and then just walk away." Morel's phone had fallen from her jacket pocket when she went down. She could see it, 3 feet away, screen glowing faintly against the wet asphalt. She reached for it, and Denton kicked it. It spun beneath her car, coming to rest near the front tire. He dragged her backward by the arm. Her shoulder screamed. She could feel the joint straining, threatening to separate. "Let go of me." "Or what? You'll call the cops? You'll testify again?" He laughed. It was an ugly sound. "Nobody's coming for you, Morel. That's what you never understood. Nobody ever was." He threw her against the side of the car. Her head hit the door frame and the world went white for a second, then gray, then slowly reassembled itself in fragments of pain and rain and concrete. Morel dropped to her hands and knees. Blood ran from a cut above her left eyebrow, mixing with rainwater and dripping onto the pavement. Her vision swam. She could hear Denton breathing behind her, pacing, working himself up the way he always did, back and forth, muttering, building toward the next explosion. She had maybe 30 seconds. She crawled forward. Her fingers found the edge of the car's undercarriage. She reached beneath it, arm scraping against wet gravel, and her fingertips touched the phone screen. She pulled it toward her, curling her body around it, shielding it with her back. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unlock it. Blood smeared across the screen. She didn't scroll through contacts. Didn't think, didn't weigh options or consider consequences. Her thumb moved to a number she had never deleted, a number she told herself she kept only because she was too tired to clean out her phone, a lie she had repeated so many times it had almost become true. The phone rang twice. "Can you come get me?" she whispered. Her voice was barely a sound, just breath shaped into words. 2 seconds of silence. No questions, no hesitation beyond those 2 seconds, which she understood later were not hesitation at all, but the sound of a man rearranging the world. "Stay alive until I arrive." The line went dead. Morel pressed the phone against her chest and closed her eyes. Rain hammered her back. She could hear Denton behind her, still pacing, still muttering. She made herself small against the car, made herself quiet, made herself wait. She didn't know if Caius would come. She didn't know if the number still worked, if the voice she heard was real, or just the last hallucination of a woman with a head wound bleeding out in a parking lot. But the words echoed through her, "Stay alive," and they carried the weight of absolute command, not a request, not encouragement, an order, the kind of order that implied consequences for the universe if it wasn't obeyed. Denton's boot scraped the ground behind her. "Get up," he said. She didn't move. "I said get up." He grabbed her arm again. She let him pull her to her feet because standing was better than being on the ground, and because she needed him to not see the phone, and because somewhere in the back of her shattered mind she was counting seconds. Denton shoved her against the car and leaned in close. "You think you're better than me? You're a waitress, Morel. You're nothing. You serve coffee to truckers at 2 a.m, and you think you have the right to judge me?" She said nothing. "Look at me." She looked. Not at him. Past him. Into the darkness at the edge of the parking lot where the streetlight couldn't reach. Headlights. Distant at first. Then closer. Moving fast. Not one set. 3. Cutting through the rain like blades. Growing larger, brighter, until the entire parking lot was washed in white light. Denton turned. 3 black SUVs exploded into the lot, tires screaming on the wet surface, fanning out in a formation that was too precise to be anything but practiced. They stopped in a semicircle, engines running, headlights pinning Denton against the car like a specimen under glass. Doors opened. Men emerged. 6 of them. 8. More. They moved with the fluid economy of professionals, dark suits, dark faces, hands already reaching beneath their jackets. They didn't shout, didn't announce themselves. They simply materialized out of the light and the rain like something summoned. Then the center SUV's rear door opened and Caius Vale stepped out. He looked exactly the same and completely different from the man who had been sitting in booth 9 an hour ago. The charcoal coat was the same, but now it moved in the storm like something alive. His face, which had been still and contemplative in the diner, was now stripped of everything except function. His eyes found Morel first, cataloging the blood, the torn jacket, the way she held her left arm against her body, and something shifted behind them. Not emotion exactly, something older, something that predated emotion and operated in the space where instinct and violence shared a border. Then his eyes moved to Denton. Denton tried to run. He made it 3 steps before 2 of Caius's men caught him. They didn't tackle him. That would have been clumsy, and these men did nothing clumsily. One hooked his arm, the other swept his legs, and Denton went face first into the asphalt with a sound like a wet bag of cement hitting concrete. They held him there, one knee on his spine, one hand pressing his face into a puddle, while he screamed and sputtered and cursed. Caius didn't look at him. Not yet. He walked to Morel, slowly. The rain battered him, but he moved through it as though it wasn't there, as though weather was something that happened to other people. He stopped 2 feet away from her and stood still for a moment, his eyes tracing the damage on her face with a precision that felt almost surgical. Then he knelt. The most feared man in Harbor City knelt on the wet concrete of a diner parking lot and gently, so gently it almost didn't register as touch, brushed the soaked hair away from her bleeding lip. "You should have called me sooner," he said. His voice was low, controlled. But underneath the control there was a current of something that made the air around them feel charged, like the moment before lightning finds its target. Morel looked at him. Blood and rain ran down her face. Her body was trembling from cold and adrenaline and the slow crash of terror leaving her system. "I wasn't supposed to call you at all," she said. He held her gaze. And yet, behind them, Denton was still screaming. Threats, insults, the desperate bravado of a small man who had just realized he was drowning in water far deeper than he ever imagined existed. Caius stood and turned toward the sound. His men stepped back slightly, not releasing Denton, but creating space. An audience forming around a stage. Caius walked to where Denton lay pinned against the ground. He crouched beside him, elbows on his knees, hands hanging loose between them. Patient, almost casual. "You know who I am," Caius said. It wasn't a question. Denton's face was pressed sideways against the asphalt, one eye visible, wild and rolling. The bravado was gone now. What replaced it was the raw animal recognition of a man staring into the face of something that could end him with less effort than it took to blink. I wasn't, Denton stammered. You put your hands on her. She's my ex. This is personal, man. This is between... Nothing about her is between you and anyone. Caius's voice didn't rise. It lowered, which was infinitely worse. You touched her. You bled her. In my city. Your city? Listen, I don't want any trouble. Trouble arrived the moment you did. Caius stood. He adjusted the cuffs of his coat sleeves with a precision that was almost meditative. Then he nodded once to his men. They lifted Denton off the ground and put him in the back of the third SUV. No explanation, no negotiation. Denton disappeared into the vehicle like a man being swallowed by the dark. Morel watched from against her car. She was shaking harder now. The adrenaline was wearing off and the cold was moving in to replace it, settling into her bones like something permanent. Caius returned to her. He shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was warm and heavy and smelled like cedar and something metallic she didn't want to identify. Can you walk? He asked. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. She pushed off the car and stood on her own. Her left knee buckled slightly, but she caught herself. I can walk. He watched her for a moment, then turned and walked toward the center SUV. He opened the rear door and waited. Morel stared at the open door. Rain pounded the roof of the vehicle. Inside, she could see leather seats in darkness and the faint green glow of a dashboard screen. It looked like a mouth, like something that would swallow her whole and never spit her back out. She knew what getting into that car meant. She had spent 7 years building a life specifically designed to keep her out of cars like that, out of rooms like the ones Caius occupied, out of the orbit of a man whose gravity bent everything around him until the original shape was gone. But her car keys were somewhere on the wet ground, and her head was bleeding and her phone screen was cracked and smeared with blood, and the only person in the entire city who had answered when she called was standing in the rain, holding a door open for her with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. She got in. The car smelled like leather and silence. Caius slid in beside her and closed the door. The noise of the storm dropped to a low roar, muffled by armored glass. Where are you taking me? Morel asked. Somewhere safe. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters right now. The convoy moved through Harbor City like a funeral procession. Slow, deliberate, untouchable. Morel watched the streets slide past through tinted windows. Pawn shops, liquor stores, shuttered businesses with security gates pulled down like metal eyelids. This was the city she'd chosen over him, the honest, ordinary, grinding life she'd believed was worth the price of leaving. Now it looked exactly like what it was. A cage with slightly thinner bars. How long were you in the diner? She asked. Long enough. You were watching me. He didn't deny it. I check on you. That's not checking on someone, Caius. That's surveillance. Call it whatever helps you sleep. I haven't slept well in 7 years. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. She saw his jaw tighten. A small movement, barely visible in the dark interior of the car, but she knew his face the way a sailor knows a coastline. Every ridge, every shadow. He said nothing. The convoy turned onto a private road that climbed above the harbor. The city fell away below them, dissolving into a scattered constellation of lights and rain. They passed through 2 security checkpoints, steel gates, armed guards, cameras tracking their approach, before pulling into an underground garage that could have held 40 cars. Caius's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building that didn't appear on most maps. Morel stepped out of the elevator into a space that felt less like an apartment and more like a controlled environment. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the entire city below, furniture that was expensive in the way that never needed to announce itself. Everything was precise. Everything was cold. Armed men stood at every entrance. They didn't acknowledge Morel. They barely acknowledged Caius. They were part of the architecture, pillars of controlled violence holding up a ceiling of power. There's a doctor coming, Caius said. He was already on his phone, speaking to someone in short, clipped sentences that sounded less like conversation and more like commands. Morel stood in the center of the living room, dripping rainwater onto marble that probably cost more than her annual salary. She was still wearing his coat. Blood from her eyebrow had dried in a line down the left side of her face, pulling the skin tight when she blinked. "I don't need a doctor." "You have a laceration above your eye, probable bruising to your left shoulder, and you're favoring your right knee. The doctor will determine what you need." She almost laughed. Almost. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Decide things. For everyone. About everything." He set his phone down on a table that was either marble or glass. In this apartment, it was hard to tell. "You called me." "I answered. This is what answering looks like." The doctor arrived 20 minutes later. A quiet, middle-aged woman with steady hands and the kind of eyes that had seen enough damage to stop reacting to it. She cleaned Morel's wounds in a guest bedroom that was larger than Morel's entire apartment. 3 butterfly stitches above the eyebrow. Ice for the shoulder. An examination of the knee that revealed deep bruising but no structural damage. "You should rest," the doctor said. "Your body has been through significant trauma." After the doctor left, Morel sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. The room was beautiful and suffocating. Every surface was smooth, every corner was sharp. Even the silence felt designed, engineered to contain specific frequencies of sound and exclude everything else. There was a knock at the door. "It's open," she said. Chaos stepped in carrying a glass of water and a bottle of ibuprofen. He set them on the nightstand and stood by the window looking out at the city below. The rain was still falling, but lighter now. The worst of the storm had passed. "Denton," Morel said. "What happens to him?" Chaos didn't turn from the window. "He's being held." "Held where?" "Somewhere he can't reach you." "That's not—" "You need to stop asking questions you already know the answers to, Morel." She went quiet. She did know the answer. She had always known who Caius was, what he was capable of, the machinery that operated beneath the surface of his calm. That knowledge was exactly why she had left. "I need to go home," she said. "Not tonight." "I'm not staying here." "You're bleeding, you're exhausted, and the man who attacked you may not have been working alone." He turned from the window and faced her. The light from the city below carved his features into something that looked less like a face and more like a geography. Hard lines, deep shadows. The terrain of a man who had been carved by forces most people never encountered. "Stay tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest." "There is no rest, Caius. There is no we. I called you because I was scared, not because I wanted back into your world. My world is the reason you're alive right now." The words landed between them like a thrown knife, not aimed to kill, aimed to pin her in place. Morel looked at the water, the ibuprofen, the immaculate room, the armed guards she could hear shifting in the hallway outside. She thought about her apartment on Fenwick Street, the leak in the bathroom ceiling, the radiator that clanked all night, the lock on the front door that she'd asked her landlord to fix 3 times. She thought about the parking lot, the rain, Denton's hand in her hair. She took 2 ibuprofen and drank the water. "One night," she said. Caius nodded once and left without another word. But Morel couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the building breathe. The mechanical hum of ventilation, the distant murmur of voices she couldn't quite decipher, the occasional muted sound of a door opening or closing somewhere in the penthouse. She was safe. She knew that. Whatever else Caius was, wherever his money came from, whatever blood stained the empire he'd built, she was physically safe in this room. That was the problem, because safety felt like surrender. And surrender in Caius Vale's world was a door that only opened in one direction. Around 3 a.m., she heard something outside her bedroom. Not guards. Their movements were regimented, mechanical. This was different. The soft sound of someone settling into furniture, the creak of leather, then silence. She opened the door. Caius was sitting on the couch in the hallway outside her room. Coat off, sleeves rolled up. His forearms rested on his knees and his head was tipped back against the wall, eyes closed but not sleeping. She could tell the difference. Sleeping Caius was something she'd seen only a handful of times years ago, and it looked nothing like this. This was a man standing guard with his eyes shut. "What are you doing?" she asked. He opened his eyes. "Go back to sleep, Morel. You're sleeping in the hallway." "I'm not sleeping." "Then what?" You have nightmares. He said it like a fact, like weather, like gravity. You had them when we were together. You screamed in your sleep and didn't remember it in the morning. I'd rather be here when it happens than 3 rooms away. She stood in the doorway, barefoot on cold marble, wearing borrowed clothes that smelled like expensive detergent and someone else's life. Something broke open inside her chest. Not dramatically, not like a dam bursting, but like a crack spreading slowly through glass. The kind of crack you don't notice until the whole thing collapses. You can't do this, she whispered. Do what? Be this. Be the man who remembers my nightmares. And also the man who... She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence because finishing it meant naming things she had spent 7 years trying to forget. Caius watched her. His expression didn't change, but his hands, hanging between his knees, closed slowly into fists and then opened again. A private war, fought entirely in the tendons of his fingers. Go back to sleep, he said again. Softer this time. She closed the door. She didn't sleep. In the morning, pale gray light filtered through the windows and the rain had finally stopped. Morel found coffee waiting on the kitchen counter. Black, 2 sugars, the way she'd taken it since she was 17. Caius was standing near the windows with his phone to his ear, his voice low and rapid, speaking to someone in a tone that made the air in the room feel heavier. When he hung up, his face had changed. The careful control was still there, but something new had crept in underneath it. Something cold and coiled and dangerous. What? Morel asked. Sit down. Just tell me. He set his phone on the counter. Denton talked. My people are persuasive when they need to be. He paused, choosing words with the care of a man disarming a bomb. 3 weeks ago, you were working the late shift, a Tuesday. 2 men came in around midnight, sat in the back booth, ordered coffee they didn't drink. Morel frowned. I remember them. They were in suits. They left a 50 on the table. They were making an exchange. Documents and cash. One of them was Victor Embry, a deputy commissioner in the Harbor City Police Department. The other was a man named Yuri Volkov. The name meant nothing to her. Caius saw it on her face. The Volkov Syndicate, he said. Russian organization. They've been operating on the edges of Harbor City for 2 years, buying cops, judges, port officials, building infrastructure for a takeover. He paused. Of my territory. What does that have to do with me? The exchange you saw. It was a payment. Embry was selling police intelligence to Volkov. Routes, schedules, informant identities, the kind of information that gets people killed. Caius's jaw tightened. You were the only civilian in the diner that night. They know your face. They know your name. They know where you work. Morel felt the floor shift beneath her. Not literally, but the axis of her reality tilted and everything that had seemed solid, her job, her routine, her careful ordinary life, suddenly felt like a stage set constructed over a pit. Denton wasn't random, she said. It wasn't a question. Denton was paid. The Volkovs gave him money and a job. Scare you. Keep you quiet. Make sure you never talk to anyone about what you saw. The assault was a message. I didn't even know what I saw. They couldn't take that chance. Morel's hands were shaking again. She set the coffee cup down before she dropped it. So what happens now? Caius looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not in the 3 months they were together, not in the years since. It was the expression of a man who had just realized that the 2 things he'd kept most separate in his life, the woman he couldn't stop loving and the empire he couldn't stop building, had collided in a way that couldn't be undone. Now, he said, you become the most hunted woman in Harbor City. He let that settle. And I become the only thing standing between you and everyone who wants you dead. Orchestrated escalating screenplay conflict with raw dialogue and dramatic cliffhanger. Orchestrated escalating screenplay conflict with raw dialogue and dramatic cliffhanger. Part 2. Morelle didn't speak for a long time after that. She stood in Caius's kitchen with her hands flat on the counter, staring at the coffee she couldn't drink, while the words settled into her body like shrapnel. Small, sharp, impossible to remove without doing more damage. The most hunted woman in Harbor City. She almost laughed. Almost. Because 24 hours ago, her biggest problem was a broken tail light and whether her landlord would fix the bathroom ceiling before the mold spread. Now she was standing in a marble fortress owned by a man she'd sworn never to see again. And somewhere out there, an entire criminal organization wanted her erased. "I need to go to work," she said finally. Caius looked at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't recognize. "You're not going to work. I have a shift at 3. If I don't show up, Ray fires me. That's rent, Caius. That's food. I'll handle it." "You'll handle my rent. I'll handle everything." Morel pushed off the counter. The ibuprofen had taken the edge off her headache, but every muscle in her body still ached, and the butterfly stitches above her eyebrow pulled when she frowned. "That's exactly what you said 7 years ago. Right before handling everything meant I couldn't go to the grocery store without 2 men in suits following me through the produce aisle. The situation is different now. The situation is exactly the same. Something dangerous happened. You showed up. And now you're telling me my life belongs to you until you decide it doesn't." Caius set his phone down with a deliberateness that most people would have mistaken for patience. It wasn't patience. It was the controlled movement of a man who understood that the wrong gesture at the wrong moment could shatter something he was trying very hard to hold together. "Morel, listen to me." His voice dropped half a register. Not louder, lower. The way a furnace doesn't get brighter when it gets hotter. It just changes color. The Volkov Syndicate has bought at least 4 officers inside the Harbor City Police Department. They have access to patrol routes, surveillance feeds, and witness databases. If you walk out of this building, they will know your location within the hour. If you go to your apartment, there may already be someone waiting. If you call the police, there is a measurable chance that the officer who answers is on Yuri Volkov's payroll. Bis ba motoserchkas. He paused. Let the silence do the work. "I am not telling you your life belongs to me. I am telling you that right now, in this moment, I am the only infrastructure standing between you and people who will kill you to protect a secret you didn't even know you were carrying." Morel's jaw tightened. She hated him for being right. She hated herself for knowing it. And underneath both of those things, buried so deep she could barely feel it, was something worse. The traitorous flicker of relief that he was here, that someone was here. That for the first time in 7 years, she wasn't alone in a room trying to figure out how to survive. "How long?" she asked. "How long what? How long do I stay here?" "Until the threat is neutralized. That could be weeks. It could be longer." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, Caius was watching her with an expression that was either concern or calculation. With him, the line between the two had always been invisible. "Fine," she said. "But I need clothes. I need my things. And I need you to understand that this is not a reunion. This is survival. That's all." He nodded once. "I'll send someone to your apartment. I'll make a list. They know what to get." That stopped her. The implications unfolded in her chest like something with teeth. They know what to get. Because someone had been watching her. Because Caius had people, eyes, hands, invisible machinery, tracking the mundane details of her life. Her clothing, her routines. The specific brand of shampoo she bought at the drugstore on Pelham Avenue. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to throw the coffee cup against the floor-to-ceiling windows and watch it shatter against a view that cost more than everything she'd ever owned combined. Instead, she said, "I'll make a list." It was the smallest rebellion she could manage, but it was hers. 2 hours later, Morel was in the back of an armored SUV heading north out of Harbor City. Caius sat beside her, phone pressed to his ear, issuing commands in short bursts to someone named Declan. In the front seat, a driver with a neck like a fire hydrant navigated through streets that grew emptier and greener as the city fell behind them. They drove for 40 minutes before turning onto a private road that cut through dense pine forest. The trees closed overhead like a cathedral ceiling, dark, ancient, suffocating. 2 checkpoints. Armed guards with earpieces and the flat professional expressions of men who had been trained to see threats the way most people see furniture. The estate appeared through the trees like something that shouldn't exist. A sprawling stone compound with tall windows and a roof that disappeared into the gray sky. It sat on a hillside surrounded by a perimeter of iron fencing and cameras mounted on posts every 30 feet. Beautiful and terrible. A gilded cage wrapped in forest. Morel stepped out of the car and the cold hit her immediately. The air smelled like pine needles and wet earth and something chemical she couldn't place. Gun oil, she realized later. The guards at the front door were carrying automatic weapons with a casualness that made her stomach turn. This is temporary, Kaya said behind her. She didn't respond. She walked through the front door and into a foyer with stone floors and high ceilings and the kind of silence that only exists in places where noise has been engineered out. A staircase swept upward to the second floor. Hallways branched in 3 directions. Every surface was clean. Every corner was lit. The whole building hummed with a low-frequency energy that felt less like a home and more like a machine in standby mode. Your room is upstairs, Kaya said. Second door on the left. There's a bathroom attached. Kitchen is through the hall. If you need anything, ask Roman. A man materialized from a side hallway, tall, lean, with a shaved head and hands that looked like they'd been specifically designed for hurting people. He nodded to Morel without smiling. Roman is head of estate security, Caius explained. He'll be here at all times. Where will you be? Morel asked. She hated that she asked, hated the way it sounded, needy, dependent, exactly the kind of question a woman in her position was supposed to ask. Caius studied her face. I have work in the city. I'll be back tonight. Work. She let the word sit between them. Both of them knew what work meant. Tonight, he repeated, and walked back toward the car. Morel watched the convoy disappear through the trees. Then she stood alone in the doorway of a fortress she hadn't asked for, surrounded by armed strangers, in the middle of a forest she couldn't navigate, holding nothing but a list of clothes she'd written on the back of a pharmacy receipt. The first 2 days were the worst. Not because of danger. Nothing happened. That was the problem. Nothing happened at all. The estate existed in a vacuum of absolute security and absolute emptiness. Morel walked the hallways. She sat in the library. An actual library. Shelves stacked floor to ceiling with books that looked like they'd never been opened. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the tree line until her vision blurred. Roman was present but invisible. He appeared when she entered a room and vanished when she left, like a shadow with a pulse. He spoke only when spoken to and answered questions with monosyllables that felt like doors closing. Can I go outside? Perimeter only. How far is the perimeter? Fence line. What's past the fence? Nothing you need. On the second night, Morel sat on the floor of her bedroom and cried. Not from fear. Fear had burned itself out sometime during the first day, leaving behind a residue of numbness that coated everything. She cried from the sheer suffocating weight of having no agency, no choices, no ability to walk out of a door and turn left or right based on nothing but her own impulse. Every room she entered was monitored. Every window she looked through was reinforced. Even the silence was controlled. The kind of silence that existed not because noise was absent, but because someone had decided exactly how much sound was permissible. She had escaped one cage and walked directly into another. The bars were nicer. The food was better. But the lock was the same. Caius returned on the third evening. Morel heard the convoy arrive, the crunch of tires on gravel, the muffled voices of men coordinating security rotations, and felt something move inside her chest that she immediately tried to kill. She stayed in the library, a book open on her lap that she hadn't read a word of, and waited for him to come find her. He did. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing the city on him, the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, the faint smell of exhaust and expensive cologne that clung to his coat. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the deep structural exhaustion of a man carrying a weight that had been accumulating for years. You haven't eaten, he said. I'm not hungry. The kitchen staff said you've had coffee and half a sandwich in 3 days. You're tracking my meals now. I'm tracking everything. That's how you stay alive. Morel closed the book. I can't do this, Caius. He stepped into the room. Do what? This. She gestured at the walls, the windows, the fortress pressing in around her. I can't sit in a beautiful prison and wait for you to decide when it's safe to exist. I can't be watched and monitored and fed on a schedule like an animal in a facility. I know you're trying to protect me. I know the danger is real. But this... Her voice cracked slightly, a fracture she hadn't authorized. This is not a life. This is storage. Caius stood still for a moment. Then he did something that surprised her. He sat down. Not in a chair. On the floor, his back against the wall opposite her, knees up, forearms resting on them. The posture of a man who was choosing, deliberately, to be at her level. Tell me what you need, he said. I need to matter. In my own life. I need to make one single decision per day that hasn't been pre-approved by a man with a gun. He looked at her. The exhaustion in his face was real. She could see it in the lines around his eyes, in the way his hands hung between his knees with a heaviness that had nothing to do with muscle. This wasn't a performance. This was a man trying to hold too many things at once and feeling the first one start to slip. Okay, he said. Okay, what? Tell me what decision you want to make. She stared at him. I want to cook my own food. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Caius didn't smile, not really, not the way normal people did. But something shifted in the architecture of his expression, a slight easing of tension that was as close to warmth as his features allowed. Done. And I want access to the grounds, not the perimeter, the actual grounds. With escort. With Roman standing 50 feet away, not breathing down my neck. 30 feet. 40. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. 40. With a radio. She nodded. It was a negotiation over scraps. She knew that. The parameters of her freedom were still being dictated by someone else. But the act of negotiating, of pushing and being pushed back and finding the line, made her feel human for the first time in 3 days. Caius stood. He paused in the doorway. I had the necklace fixed. Morel blinked. What? The necklace. The silver one with the blue stone. Denton broke the clasp during the attack. I had it repaired. He reached into his coat pocket and set a small velvet pouch on the bookshelf beside the door. Then he left. Morel sat for a long time staring at the pouch. The necklace inside was cheap. She'd bought it herself at a street market 3 years ago, a thin silver chain with a piece of blue glass that pretended to be topaz. It was worth maybe $12. In this house, surrounded by things that cost more than her car, it was practically garbage. But he'd noticed it was broken. He'd had it fixed. She picked up the pouch and held it in her palm. The velvet was warm from his pocket. She could feel the small weight of the chain inside, the familiar shape of the stone pressing against her fingers through the fabric. Something was happening to her that she didn't want and couldn't control. A softening, a thawing. The ice she'd built between herself and Caius Vale, carefully, deliberately, over 7 years of deliberate distance, was developing cracks that she couldn't seal fast enough. She put the necklace on. The days developed a rhythm. Morel cooked breakfast in the estate kitchen, eggs, toast, black coffee with 2 sugars, while Roman stood at the edge of the tree line with his radio and his flat expression. She walked the grounds in the afternoons, following deer trails through the pines until the fence appeared like a reminder. She read in the library. She slept badly, but she slept. Caius came and went. Sometimes he was gone for 2 days. Sometimes he arrived late at night and she heard him moving through the house like a ghost, opening doors, checking locks, standing at windows in the dark. When he was there, they talked, carefully. Like 2 people walking through a minefield of shared history, each step calculated to avoid detonation. One night, she came downstairs to find him in the kitchen at 2 a.m. He was standing at the counter with a glass of whiskey, his shirt untucked, his sleeves pushed past his elbows. There was blood on his knuckles. Not his. The skin wasn't broken. Someone else's blood, dried to a dark crust in the creases of his fingers. Morel stopped in the doorway. Caius looked up. He saw her see the blood. He didn't hide his hands. He didn't move them behind his back or wash them first. He just stood there holding the glass and let her look. Bad night? She said. Complicated night. She walked to the sink and turned on the water, tested the temperature with her wrist. Then she took his free hand and held it under the faucet. The blood ran off his knuckles in thin brown streams swirling down the drain. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the water and the ticking of a clock somewhere in the hallway. When his hands were clean, she turned off the faucet and handed him a dish towel. Their fingers touched during the transfer. Neither pulled away. You scare me, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was geography. She was mapping the terrain between them and naming what she found. I know, he said. Does that bother you? He dried his hands slowly, methodically, the way he did everything, with a precision that left no room for accident. It used to. And now? Now I'd rather you be scared and alive than comfortable and dead. Morel leaned against the counter beside him, close enough to feel the heat coming off his body, not close enough to touch. The space between them was maybe 6 inches, and it contained the entire history of everything they'd been and everything they'd broken. She used to ask me the same thing, Kaya said quietly. Whether it bothered me. Morel looked at him. Who? Lena. The name landed in the kitchen like a stone dropping into still water. Morel knew the name. She'd heard it once, years ago, whispered by one of Caius's men who didn't know she was listening. Lena. Before Morel. The woman before. What happened to her, Morel asked. She'd never asked before. She'd never wanted the answer. Caius took a drink, set the glass down. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything. No anger, no grief, no performance. Just the bare mechanical sound of a man reciting facts about his own destruction. She was shot in a parking garage. 2 rounds. 1 to the chest, 1 to the head. Professional hit. Meant for me, aimed at her. He paused. We'd been together 8 months. I thought I could keep her safe. I was wrong. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the specific gravity of understanding, the weight of suddenly knowing why a man who could command an army had been sleeping on a couch outside her bedroom door. That's why you let me leave, Morel said. I didn't let you leave. I made you leave. I picked fights. I withdrew. I made myself so cold and so distant that leaving felt like your idea, because if it was your idea, you'd stay gone. And if you stayed gone, you'd stay alive. Morel felt something fundamental rearrange itself inside her chest. Every fight they'd had in those final weeks, every cold silence, every unanswered call, every moment she'd interpreted as cruelty or indifference, reframed itself in an instant. He hadn't been pushing her away because he stopped caring. He'd been pushing her away because caring was the thing that got people killed. Caius, don't. His voice was rough. Don't say what you're about to say, because it doesn't change anything. Lena is dead. You almost died 3 days ago. The common variable in both equations is me. She wanted to argue. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and force him to look at her and tell him he was wrong, that he wasn't a variable, that he was a person, and people didn't get to reduce themselves to equations. But she didn't, because part of what he said was true, and the part that wasn't true was something she couldn't fix with words at 2 a.m. in a kitchen that smelled like whiskey and someone else's blood. Good night, Caius, she said. Good night, Morel. She went upstairs. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe and thought about a woman named Lena who loved a dangerous man and died in a parking garage. And she wondered if the universe was trying to tell her something, or if it was just repeating itself the way it always did. The same mistakes, the same patterns, the same people walking into the same fires with their eyes wide open. Morel woke at dawn to the sound of something wrong, not noise, the absence of it. The estate operated on a constant low hum of human activity, guards rotating shifts, doors opening and closing on schedules, the distant murmur of radio communication that had become background noise. That hum was gone. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, of something coiled. She sat up. Through her window, the tree line was still dark, the pines black against a sky barely beginning to lighten. Nothing moved. Then she saw it. A flash deep in the trees. Brief. Sharp. Like sunlight catching glass. Or a scope. The first shot punched through the downstairs windows with a sound like the world cracking open. It was followed immediately by a second, a third, a fourth, a staccato chain of impacts that shattered glass and thudded into walls and turned the quiet morning into something out of a war zone. Morel threw herself off the bed and hit the floor. Her palms slammed against hardwood. Her heart went from sleeping to redline in 1 second flat. Gunfire, real gunfire, not television gunfire, was louder and uglier than anything she'd expected. Each shot had weight. Each impact shook the floor beneath her. Shouting erupted from the hallway. Roman's voice, sharp, commanding, stripped of every monosyllable she'd ever heard from him. He was screaming orders into a radio, his words coming so fast they blurred together. North perimeter compromised. Multiple shooters in the tree line. All units respond. The door to her room burst open. Roman stood there, weapon drawn, his face transformed into something she barely recognized. The quiet, invisible shadow who brought her coffee and stood at 40 feet was gone. In his place was a machine built for a single purpose. Get up. Now. Stay behind me. Don't stop moving. Morel scrambled to her feet. She was barefoot, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, her hair tangled from sleep. Roman grabbed her arm and pulled her into the hallway, which was already filling with smoke. Not fire smoke, something chemical, acrid, stinging her eyes and throat. "What's happening?" she gasped. "We're under attack." They moved through the house at a speed that didn't allow for thought. Down the staircase. Through the foyer. The floor was covered in broken glass that cut into Morel's bare feet, leaving bloody prints on the stone. She felt the pain distantly, the way you feel a burn after the initial shock. Present but irrelevant, drowned out by the overwhelming imperative to move. The front windows were destroyed. Morning light poured through ragged holes in the walls where bullets had torn through stone and plaster. Outside, she could see muzzle flashes in the trees, dozens of them, winking in the pre-dawn darkness like malevolent fireflies. Then she heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to gunfire. A low roar building from somewhere beneath them, and the floor vibrated, and the air turned hot. Fire. The lower floor of the east wing was burning. Flames crawled up the walls with a speed that seemed almost deliberate, feeding on something accelerant, spreading through the hallways with an intelligence that made Morel's skin crawl. This wasn't accidental. Someone had set this building to burn. Roman pulled her toward the back of the house. Through a kitchen she'd cooked breakfast in 6 hours ago, now filling with smoke so thick she could barely see her own hands. Her lungs burned. Her eyes streamed. She stumbled over something on the floor. A body, she realized with a spike of horror. One of the guards, face down, not moving. "Don't look," Roman said. "Move." They reached a door at the back of the kitchen, heavy, steel-reinforced, with a keypad lock that Roman punched in 4 digits on without breaking stride. The door opened into a stairwell that led down into darkness. "Underground tunnel," Roman said. "Goes north, half a mile, exits in the forest past the perimeter." The tunnel was narrow and cold, and smelled like damp concrete and rust. Emergency lights cast weak orange pools every 20 feet, barely enough to see the ground. Morel ran barefoot on cold concrete, her cut feet leaving bloody smears with every step, Roman's hand on her arm the only thing keeping her upright. Behind them, the estate groaned. She could hear the fire consuming it, a deep, structural sound, like the building's bones were breaking. Then a new sound reached her, distant but growing louder, a car engine. They burst from the tunnel exit into a clearing surrounded by pines. The sky was lighter now, thin gray, barely dawn, and the cold hit Morel's sweat-soaked skin like a wall. A black SUV was already there, engine running, headlights cutting through the forest mist. The back door opened and Caius stepped out. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His coat was gone. His shirt was wrinkled and the collar was open, and there was a wildness in his eyes that Morel had never seen before. Not rage exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man whose carefully constructed world was being torn apart while he watched. "Get in," he said. Morel got in. Roman followed. The SUV was moving before the door closed, tires churning through mud and pine needles, accelerating through the trees on a road that barely existed. Caius was on his phone. His voice was different now. Not the controlled, measured tone she was used to, but something harder, rawer, with an edge that cut through the words like a blade through paper. "How many?" "Which unit?" "I want a name, Declan. I want it in the next 10 minutes or start counting your own teeth." He hung up. His hand was shaking. She had never seen Caius Vale's hands shake. "What happened?" she asked. He stared straight ahead. The muscles in his jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "One of my captains. Brennan. He sold our position to the Volkovs." "Someone inside your organization." "Sold us?" "Yes. The estate location was classified. 4 people knew it. Brennan was one of them." He turned to look at her and his eyes were terrifying. Not because of anger, though there was anger. Because underneath the anger was something that looked like fear. And Caius Vale was not a man who wore fear on his face unless the situation had deteriorated past every contingency he'd built. "They knew exactly where you were sleeping. The first shots were aimed at your window." Morel felt the blood drain from her face. She looked down at her hands in her lap. They were filthy. Smoke, blood from her feet, dirt from the tunnel floor. They were shaking the same way his were. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere Brennan doesn't know about. Somewhere nobody knows about." The SUV hit a paved road and accelerated hard enough to push Morel back against the seat. Trees blurred past. The sky was brightening, but the light felt wrong. Thin and cold, like dawn in a world that had shifted on its axis overnight. Caius reached across the seat and took her hand. His grip was tight. Too tight. His fingers closed around hers with a force that was less comfort and more anchor. A man grabbing the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart. She squeezed back. Then the gunshot came from behind them. The rear window spiderwebbed but held, armored glass fracturing into a constellation of white lines. The driver swore and swerved. A second shot hit the side panel with a deep metallic thud. Morel ducked instinctively, her body folding forward, hands over her head. "Contact rear!" Roman shouted from the front passenger seat, already twisting to look through the damaged window. Caius moved with a speed that erased the exhaustion from his body. He reached beneath the seat and pulled out a matte black handgun with the efficiency of a man retrieving his keys. His face changed, everything soft, everything human, everything that had been sitting on a library floor negotiating her walking distance. All of it disappeared. What replaced it was the thing Harbor City whispered about, the Predator, the Ghost King. He rolled down the window 3 inches and fired twice into the vehicle behind them. The shots were precise, mechanical, devoid of anything that resembled hesitation. The pursuing car swerved, clipped a guardrail, and spun into the trees with a crash that sent branches flying across the road. But there was a second car behind it. The driver accelerated. The engine screamed. The road curved and climbed, and the forest fell away on one side, revealing a drop of 50 feet down a rocky hillside. Morel gripped the seat with both hands, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps that she couldn't control. Caius leaned forward between the seats. "Route 7. Take the split at the bridge." The driver nodded and pushed the SUV harder. The second pursuing vehicle was gaining. Morel could see it in the side mirror, a dark sedan, close enough now that she could make out 2 figures through the windshield. Then Caius did something she didn't expect. He turned to her. In the middle of the chase, with bullets embedded in the car and a hostile vehicle 50 yards behind them, he turned to look at her face. "I pushed you away," he said. The words came out raw and unfinished, ripped from somewhere deep enough that they hadn't been polished by his usual control. 7 years ago. I made you hate me because I thought distance would keep you safe. Lena was dead, and I couldn't—" His voice broke. Actually broke. A fracture in the concrete that she felt in her own chest. "I couldn't survive it again." Another shot hit the car. The driver swerved. "Caius, this is not the time." "There is no time. There's never been time. That's the whole point." He held her gaze with an intensity that burned through the chaos around them. The gunfire, the engine noise, the screaming tires, all of it reduced to background static behind the gravity of what he was saying. "I never stopped. Not for 1 day. Not for 1 hour. I watched you from a distance because it was the only way I could love you without killing you." Morel stared at him. Her eyes were burning. From smoke, from tears, from the raw friction of too many emotions moving through too small a space. She grabbed his face with both hands, her dirty, bloody, shaking hands on either side of his jaw. And she kissed him, hard, desperate. The kiss tasted like smoke and copper and 7 years of silence, and it lasted exactly 3 seconds before the driver yelled and the car lurched sideways and Caius pulled away and fired 2 more shots out the window. The second pursuing car fell back. Whether it was hit or simply outpaced, Morel couldn't tell. The SUV crossed a narrow bridge at a speed that rattled the guardrails, turned onto a side road, and disappeared into a stretch of forest so dense that the sky vanished overhead. Morel sat back in her seat, chest heaving, blood on her feet and her hands and her mouth where she'd kissed him. Caius ejected the magazine from his weapon, checked the round count, and slid it back in with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. He turned to look at her. There was blood on his mouth too, hers, from her split lip reopened by the force of the kiss. He didn't wipe it away. "When this is over," she started. "When this is over," he said, "nothing will be the same." The SUV drove deeper into the trees. the road narrowing until branches scraped the sides like fingers trying to pull them back. Behind them, a column of black smoke rose above the tree line where the estate was still burning, and in the distance, barely audible beneath the engine noise and the blood pounding in Morel's ears, the sound of sirens multiplied across the morning air like the opening notes of something that could not be stopped. The safe house was a mechanic's workshop on the eastern edge of nowhere, a gray concrete building with a corrugated metal roof and 3 bays large enough to hide the SUV and 2 other vehicles that were already there when they arrived. No sign, no address visible from the road. The kind of place that existed in the space between official maps, in the margin where the city stopped caring and the forest started. Morel stepped out onto oil-stained concrete and the cold cut through her t-shirt like a blade. Her feet left bloody prints with every step. The cuts from the broken glass weren't deep, but they were numerous, a constellation of small wounds that had been bleeding steadily since the estate kitchen. And the combination of blood loss and shock, and a body that had been running on adrenaline for 16 straight hours, had reduced her to a state of functioning that was barely distinguishable from not functioning at all. Roman handed her a blanket from a storage shelf, rough wool, smelling like motor oil and old canvas. She wrapped it around her shoulders without speaking. 2 of Caius's men were already in the building. They straightened when he entered, and the look that passed between them and Caius was the kind of look that communicated an entire situation report in 3 seconds without a word being spoken. Bad news. Contained, but bad. Report, Caius said. The taller of the 2, a man named Soren, who Morel had seen twice at the estate and recognized by the diagonal scar across his left eyebrow, stepped forward. He held a tablet, the screen showing a satellite image of the estate, what remained of the estate. The building was gone, not damaged, gone. The image showed a footprint of blackened stone and collapsed structure, smoke still rising in gray columns against a sky that was now fully light. Whatever accelerant the Volkovs had used, it had consumed the building so thoroughly that only the foundation remained, standing in the ash like a skeleton picked clean. Morel stared at the image and felt something cold move through her that wasn't the temperature. Casualties? Caius asked. Soren's jaw tightened. 4 confirmed, 2 guards on the north perimeter, 1 in the east corridor. A pause. And Reeves. Something moved through Caius' face. A compression, swift and terrible, like a building absorbing an impact. Reeves. She didn't know the name, but she understood from the way Caius's hand stilled completely that it wasn't just a name, it was someone who mattered. How? Caius said. He was covering the tunnel exit. They had a team positioned in the forest past the perimeter. He gave us the 30 seconds we needed to reach the car. Soren paused again. He didn't make it back out. The silence in the workshop was total. Even the ambient sounds of the building, the creak of the metal roof, the distant drip of water somewhere in the back, seemed to go quiet out of respect. Caius turned and walked to the far wall. He stood there with his back to the room, one hand pressed flat against the concrete, his head slightly bowed, not praying, not breaking down, processing. Morel had seen the same posture in the emergency room once, in a man waiting to hear whether his wife had survived surgery. The body's attempt to hold itself together while the mind did something that required all available resources. Nobody spoke. After 30 seconds, Caius straightened. When he turned around, his face was sealed again. Every crack mortared, every fracture plastered over. Only his eyes betrayed the internal temperature, and only if you knew what you were looking for. "Brennan," he said. "Where is he?" Soren glanced at the second man, shorter, stocky, with the kind of stillness that suggested he was accustomed to being in rooms where things happened that never got reported. "We have a location, Industrial District, South Side, warehouse on Carteret Street. He went there after the attack." "He thinks we're dead," Caius said. "He thinks the fire finished what the gun started." A pause. Something calculated moved behind Caius's eyes. "Good. Let him keep thinking that for a few more hours." He turned to Roman. "Get her feet treated. There's a medical kit in the back bay. Then I need you in the office. I have to make calls." Roman nodded and gestured for Morel to follow. She did, through a side door and into a narrow space that had once been a break room. A folding table, 2 metal chairs, a sink with a cracked mirror above it. Roman found the medical kit under the sink and opened it with the efficiency of a man who had treated field wounds before, and found nothing remarkable about doing it again. Morel sat on the table and put her feet in his hands. He cleaned each cut without ceremony, antiseptic that burned with a clean, concentrated ferocity, then gauze, then surgical tape. He worked in silence, and she was grateful for it. She had no words left. She was operating entirely on the surface of herself, the deeper layers temporarily unreachable. She could hear Caius through the thin wall. His voice was low and rapid and relentless. One call ending and another beginning before the first had fully finished, like a man fighting a fire on multiple fronts simultaneously. She caught fragments, names she didn't recognize, places, numbers, the language of an empire managing a crisis in real time. When Roman finished, her feet were wrapped well enough to walk on without bleeding through her socks. He found her a pair of boots 2 sizes too big from a shelf in the back bay, and a thermal layer that smelled like someone else's sweat but was dry and warm. She put both on without complaint. She was sitting at the folding table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Roman had produced from a machine that had no business functioning in this building, when the door opened and Caius came in. He sat across from her. The energy around him had shifted, less raw than it had been in the car, more focused, more dangerous in a different way. The grief was still there, sealed beneath the surface, but above it was something operational and cold. "I need to tell you something," he said. "More bad news." "Yes." Morel set the coffee down. She aligned it carefully with the edge of the table, a small, unnecessary act of order in a situation that had none. "Tell me." "Brennan has been feeding the Volkovs information for approximately 6 months. My people found communication records on a device in his apartment, encrypted, but our technical team broke the encryption an hour ago." Caius folded his hands on the table. He didn't just sell them the estate location, he sold them everything. My financial infrastructure, safe house locations, including 3 that I was planning to move you through after tonight. Names and addresses of people who work for me, people who have families. His jaw worked, and he sold them something else. He paused. Morel waited. He sold them the Embry evidence. She frowned. "What Embry evidence?" "When I learned about Deputy Commissioner Embry's payment at the diner, the transaction you witnessed, my people moved quickly. We spent 10 days building a file. Bank records, surveillance footage, wire transfer documentation that connected Embry to the Volkov syndicate beyond any reasonable doubt, enough to bring down Embry, 3 other officers, and 2 city council members who were part of the same network." Caius's voice was controlled, but the edges were razor sharp. That file was going to be our insurance, our leverage, the kind of evidence that, when delivered to the right federal contacts, would collapse the Volkovs' entire political infrastructure in Harbor City and remove their protection from every institution they'd bought. What happened to it? Brennan knew where the file was kept. Digital copies and hard copies. The digital copies were purged remotely at 4:17 this morning, 17 minutes after the attack on the estate began. The hard copies were at a secondary location that Brennan also had access to. Those were taken. Caius let that settle between them. They destroyed it all, the entire case. 6 months of my organization's intelligence work, gone. Morel sat with this. The scale of it refused to assemble itself into something comprehensible. It was too large, too complete. A betrayal that hadn't just stabbed, it had methodically removed every weapon and every exit before the stabbing began. "So there's nothing," she said. "There is me," Caius said. "My word, my knowledge of what happened. But without documentation, without evidence that survived Brennan's purge." He stopped. "I have powerful enemies and no leverage to use against them." Morel looked at him. "They're going to come for us again. They will. And now they know we survived the estate. Embry will have pushed the Harbor City Police Department to put out a warrant. There will be a narrative. A crime boss and an unnamed female associate, wanted for questioning in connection with arson and multiple deaths at an illegal compound outside the city. They'll make us the perpetrators of our own attack." The coffee was cold. Morel didn't notice. She was staring at the cracked mirror above the sink, looking at the 2 of them, her in borrowed clothes and taped-up feet, him in yesterday's shirt with someone else's death behind his eyes, and thinking about what it meant to have no good options left. "What do we do?" she said. "First, Brennan." His voice, when he said the name, was a temperature below human. "The drive to the industrial district took 40 minutes. Morel stayed at the safe house, not because she agreed to, but because Caius's expression when she suggested coming made it clear that this particular argument would cost more than it was worth to have. She sat in the break room and listened to the second vehicle leave, and she thought about the word betrayal and what it did to a person over time. Not the act itself, the aftermath. The specific damage that comes from discovering that someone who stood inside your trust used it as a map to find your most vulnerable coordinates. She thought about Caius and Reeves and the estate burning and 4 men who hadn't made it out of the tunnel. She thought about 6 months of evidence, systematically dismantled in 17 minutes by someone who had eaten at the same table and called himself loyal. She thought about the woman named Lena in a parking garage and understood for the first time the exact weight Caius had been carrying for the years she'd spent being angry at him. He came back 2 hours later. He didn't tell her what happened to Brennan. He didn't need to. It was written in the specific quality of his silence. Not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had done something that words would only diminish. He washed his hands at the shop sink for a long time, the water running dark. When he sat across from her again, his eyes were different, older. Something had been deposited in them that hadn't been there before, a sediment of cost that settled at the bottom and didn't wash out. He told us something useful, Caius said. Before. Morel didn't ask before what. What? The Volkovs have a timeline. They're not going to wait for a second opportunity to take us quietly. After the estate failed, Yuri Volkov made a decision to escalate publicly. He wants this finished in a way that sends a message, not just to me, but to every organization and institution in Harbor City that might consider opposing him after I'm gone. What kind of message? Caius's eyes met hers. The charity gala. The Hargrove Foundation event 2 weeks from now. Black tie, 500 guests, 3 city council members, the harbor commissioner, 2 federal judges, cameras, press. The kind of event that ends up in the newspaper regardless of what happens. Morel's stomach turned over. They want to kill me there. Publicly. They want to kill you there and frame me for it. A public execution, executed by operatives dressed as my men, witnessed by 500 people including the press. My organization gets blamed. Harbor City turns against me. Every alliance I have collapses. And the Volkovs walk into the vacuum looking like the force that removed the monster. He exhaled slowly. It's elegant, in a repulsive way. Can you stop it? 2 weeks ago, yes. I had the infrastructure, the evidence, the contacts. Now, he shook his head. Brennan's information is already in their hands. Every safe house he knew is burned. Every contact he could identify is in danger. My organization is fractured and leaking, and Harbor City's law enforcement apparatus has an unknown number of Volkov assets embedded in it. So we have nothing. We have 2 weeks. To do what? Caius leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his eyes direct and unblinking. Rebuild from what they didn't destroy. Identify what Brennan didn't know. The assets he couldn't reach, the contacts buried deep enough that his access level never touched them. Reestablish the evidence chain using sources that survived the purge. You make it sound like a plan. It is a plan. It sounds like a list of things we'd need and don't have. Every plan starts that way. Morel pushed her hair back from her face. The butterfly stitches above her eyebrow pulled. She felt the pull of each one individually, a small, precise pain that she found herself grateful for because it kept her present, kept her from floating off into the abstracted horror of the situation and never coming back. What do you need from me? She said. He studied her. You were a witness to the original exchange. Even without the documentation, your testimony to the right federal authority would get me killed before I finished the sentence. You said it yourself. Embry has contacts in the department. The Volkovs have eyes on us. Not if we control the conditions. Not if we choose the federal contact carefully, approach through a channel the Volkovs can't monitor, and ensure that your testimony is recorded and distributed simultaneously to multiple parties before anyone can move to stop it. He paused. I have one contact, a federal investigator named Crane. She's been building a case against harbor corruption for 3 years. She's independent, not city, not state. Nobody in Embry's network reaches her. You trust her? The hesitation was brief, but she caught it. I trust that she wants Embry more than she wants me, and right now, that's sufficient. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the corrugated roof in irregular bursts. Somewhere in the back of the building, one of the guards was moving equipment, the sound of metal on concrete punctuating the silence between sentences. Morel looked at this table between them, at his hands, at the faint line of darkness still visible under his thumbnail where the washing hadn't been quite thorough enough. "If we go to this federal investigator," she said, "and if she records my testimony, and if we can rebuild enough of the evidence chain to make it credible, what happens to you?" Caius was quiet. "Caius, I have an immunity arrangement in progress with a federal prosecutor. It's been in negotiation for 14 months. In exchange for the Embry evidence and testimony that dismantles the Volkov network in Harbor City, certain aspects of my organization's activities receive protection from prosecution." He chose his words with the care of a surgeon selecting instruments. "It's not a pardon. It's a severance. I walk away from what I built, and the government gets what it needs to clean the city." Morel stared at him. "You were already planning to get out." "I've been planning it since Lena. 7 years. Architecture takes time." She sat with this for a long time. The rain had begun again. She could hear it against the metal roof now, irregular and sharp, like static building towards something. The workshop felt smaller in the rain, more compressed. 2 people inside a shell of concrete and steel, while the world outside made decisions about their lives. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. His expression didn't change, which was itself an answer. "Caius." "The immunity arrangement." He stopped, started again. "It was conditional, contingent on the evidence being delivered intact and credible." "The evidence Brennan destroyed." "Yes." "So the arrangement is currently void." Morel let out a long breath. "So if you help me get to Crane, if I testify, if we rebuild the case, you're doing it without protection." "I'm doing it because it's the only move left. You could walk away right now. You could disappear. You have resources." "I could." His eyes were steady, absolutely steady. "And you would spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Because they don't stop, Morel. The Volkovs don't walk away from loose ends. Without the network being dismantled, without Embry and his people taken down, they will find you eventually, and they will make you an example. So will you, without immunity. I can manage that risk. You can't. I have been managing risks you can't imagine for 15 years. His voice was quiet, but the force behind it was immense, like a current running under still water. "Let me make this decision." Morel wanted to fight it. She could feel the argument building in her chest, every word of resistance stacking up behind her teeth. But underneath the resistance was something she couldn't argue past, the recognition that he had chosen, again, to put himself between her and the worst thing that was coming. And this time it wasn't because she was a weakness he was trying to protect. It was because she mattered, simply and completely. She mattered. She was about to speak when Soren appeared in the doorway. His face had the tight, compressed quality of a man delivering something unwelcome. "We have a problem," he said. Caius looked at him. "Which one?" "Crane, the federal investigator." Soren hesitated, a fractional pause that lasted less than a second, but was long enough that both Caius and Morel registered it. "She made contact 20 minutes ago. She wants a meeting. We were going to approach her ourselves. How did she? She's been building a parallel file, independent of yours. Her investigators have been running surveillance on the diner for 4 months. Apparently the Tuesday night exchange between Embry and the Volkov representative wasn't the first one." Soren paused again. "She has surveillance footage of the diner from 6 separate dates, and she has a witness who can corroborate the chain of payments." Another pause. "The witness has been in federal protective custody for 3 weeks. Caius frowned. "Who?" Soren looked at Morel. Not at Caius. At Morel. "Her name is Ada Vane," Soren said. "She's been cooperating with Crane's investigation since—" Morel went cold. Not cold like the workshop was cold. Cold like something turning off inside her. Like a light source blinking out. "Say that name again," she whispered. Soren looked uncomfortable. "Ada Vane. She identified herself as my mother." The words came out flat and airless. "My mother is in federal custody." The room went still. Morel stood up from the table. The boots were too big and she nearly caught her heel on the chair leg, but she caught herself and stood very straight, the blanket still around her shoulders, her taped feet on the oil-stained floor, and she looked at Caius. His face told her everything she needed before he said a word. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hands went flat on the table. He wasn't surprised. He was managing the arrival of information he had been anticipating. "You knew," she said. Not her specifically. "How much?" "Morel." "How much did you know?" He stood. "I knew Crane had a witness connected to the diner. I learned the identity 2 hours ago. Before I came back from—" He stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "When I had a clearer picture of what it meant." "What it means." Morel's voice was very quiet now, which was worse than shouting. She knew it was worse than shouting because she could feel the temperature dropping inside herself, the hot panic being replaced by something colder and more precise. "What it means is that my mother has been sitting in a federal safe house for 3 weeks watching this happen, watching me get attacked, watching me disappear into your fortress." And she said nothing. She couldn't. The terms of her cooperation require— "Don't!" Morel took a step back. "Don't explain it to me in operational language. Don't make it neat. My mother knew I was in danger. She knew why. And she was sitting somewhere safe and quiet and cooperating with a federal investigation while someone tried to burn me alive." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, like a hairline fracture in glass. Caius moved toward her. She put her hand up. "Don't." He stopped. Morel pressed her palm against her sternum, not dramatically. Just a small private pressure, a hand against the chest to check whether the structure was still sound. She breathed through it, in and out, the way she'd learned in the parking lot, in the years with Denton, in every moment when the world tilted past the angle a human being was designed to handle. "Why is she cooperating?" Morel said finally. "What does she have?" Soren looked at Caius, who nodded. Ada Vane worked part-time as a bookkeeper for 2 businesses on the South Harbor for the past 4 years. Both businesses were Volkov front operations. She may not have known that initially, but according to her testimony to Crane, she became aware of the nature of the operations approximately 18 months ago. Soren's voice was careful, precise, the practiced neutrality of someone delivering a briefing. She copied financial records over a period of 6 months. Transaction logs, cash flow documentation, records of payments to city officials. She approached Crane's office 11 weeks ago. Man. Morel stared at the floor. She was doing the math. 11 weeks ago, her mother had walked into a federal investigator's office carrying 6 months of evidence. 3 weeks ago, her mother had entered protective custody, which meant that for 8 weeks, Ada Vane had been sitting somewhere between a decision and a consequence, building towards something she apparently hadn't told her daughter anything about. "She's trying to protect you," Caius said. Gently, because even he understood that gentleness was the only tool appropriate for this particular demolition. "She's been protecting me in secret for 8 weeks. The investigation required—" "I don't care what the investigation required." Morel's voice rose for the first time, just slightly. An increase in pressure, like a valve edging open. "She's my mother. She looked me in the face. I had dinner with her 6 weeks ago. I sat at her table and she made pasta, and we talked about whether I should take a second job. She was sitting there with 6 months of financial records copied for a federal investigator, and she made pasta and talked about my rent." She stopped, pressed her hand against her chest again. Caius said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some things didn't fit inside language. "I want to see her," Morel said. "Crane controls access. I want to see my mother." Caius looked at Soren. "Tell Crane we'll take the meeting. All terms negotiable. Location of her choosing." Soren nodded and stepped out. Caius crossed the room to Morel. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which she needed more than she wanted to admit. He didn't touch her. He waited. "She was trying to get you out," he said, "before any of this happened. She was building a case that would have taken the Volkovs down, taken Embry down, and removed the danger to you before you even knew the danger existed. She was racing the clock." "She lost the race." "Yes." Morel turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. She'd gone past the point where crying was available as a response, past that border into the stark, flat territory on the other side where things were simply true and no amount of water changed them. "If Crane has my mother's evidence and my testimony," she said slowly, And if you can rebuild whatever Brennan destroyed, it rebuilds the case. Yes. And your immunity deal? A pause. The deal was with a city prosecutor. The jurisdiction shifts entirely if we go federal. Crane operates under a different authority, one that Embry's network doesn't reach. Something moved in his eyes. Not hope, exactly. The structural precursor to hope. The recognition that a path exists, even if the path runs through something terrible. If Crane takes the case federal, the city-level deal becomes irrelevant. A new arrangement becomes possible. Possible, Morel repeated. Not certain. Nothing is certain. I stopped believing in certainty a long time ago. She looked at him for a long moment. The fluorescent light above them buzzed and flickered, cheap industrial lighting doing its best against the darkness of the workshop. In it, Caius Vale looked like what he was. A dangerous man at the end of his resources, having traded everything he'd built for a single remaining move. 2 weeks until the gala, she said. 13 days now. Then we have 13 days to rebuild a case, make contact with a federal investigator, and she stopped. Because the next part was the one she hadn't said aloud yet, hadn't allowed herself to fully form. And I'm the only surviving civilian witness to the original exchange, which means I'm the only person Embry and the Volkovs need to eliminate to make the whole thing fall apart. Yes, Caius said. Which is why they're going to use the gala. She was seeing it now, the architecture of it, assembling in her mind with a clarity that frightened her. Not just clarity about the threat, clarity about what it would take to survive it. They want me there, in public, where they can make the kill look like something else. She paused. So we give them what they want. Caius went very still. What? We go to the gala. We put ourselves in the room, but we control the conditions, not them. That's not, you said it yourself. They're going to come regardless. Running doesn't work. We've been running for days and they keep finding us. Morel's voice was steady now, steadier than it had been since the parking lot. There was something almost dangerous in the steadiness. So we stop running. We choose the ground. We walk in there and we finish it. Caius stared at her. Whatever he was about to say, the caution, the objection, the operational risk assessment that lived in the front of his mind, stalled. Because he was looking at her face, and on her face was an expression he recognized. He'd seen it in mirrors, in the years before he'd learned to be afraid of himself. The look of someone who had exhausted every other option and arrived at the only one. The meeting with Crane happened in a parking structure on the west side of the city, 4th level, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when the surrounding blocks were empty enough that approaching headlights would be visible from 300 yards in any direction. Caius chose the location. Crane accepted it without negotiation, which told Caius something about how badly she wanted this meeting. Morel sat in the back of the SUV while Caius and Soren stood 20 feet away in the yellow wash of a parking structure light, talking to a woman in a gray coat who moved like someone who had spent years in rooms where every word was being recorded and had learned to make her body language say nothing at all. Federal investigator. Mid-40s, short dark hair, a face built for keeping things private. Crane. Helena Crane. Morel watched through the window. She couldn't hear the conversation. She could read the shapes of it. Crane talking, measured, her hands staying at her sides. Caius listening with his arms crossed and his weight on his back foot, the posture of a man who was evaluating every word for structural integrity before accepting any of it into the architecture of his plans. Soren standing slightly behind and to the right, his eyes moving continuously across the surrounding levels. It lasted 11 minutes. Then Caius walked back to the car. He got in, closed the door, sat for a moment with his hands on his knees. She has more than we thought, he said. How much more? The financial records from your mother cover 18 months of Volkov operations in Harbor City. Cash flows, political payments, asset transfers. It's not just Embry. It's a network of 14 individuals across city government, the police department, and the Port Authority. He paused. And she has something else. A recording. Audio, made by your mother during a meeting she attended 14 months ago. In it, Yuri Volkov explicitly authorizes payments to 3 specific officials and discusses the timeline for consolidating control over the harbor district. Morel was quiet for a moment. Volkov himself. On tape, his voice, his words, his authorization. It's the kind of evidence that doesn't require corroboration. It corroborates everything else by existing. Caius turned to look at her. Your mother didn't just copy documents, Morel. She walked into a room with a recording device and sat across from Yuri Volkov and held her face still while he talked. Morel pressed her fingers against her mouth, held them there for 3 seconds. She never told me anything. She was protecting you. I know. A pause. That doesn't make it smaller. No, Caius agreed. It doesn't. When can I see her? After. Crane's terms. Your testimony is recorded first, delivered to a federal handler outside Crane's chain of command simultaneously, so no single point of failure can bury it. After that's done and the files are distributed, the protective custody arrangement becomes less critical. Your mother will have more freedom. After. A word that contained 13 days and a charity gala and an unknown number of Volkov operatives and the specific shape of everything that could go wrong. What does Crane need from you? Morel asked. Operational support. She has evidence and she has a federal case being built, but she has no mechanism for controlling what happens at the gala. Her jurisdiction covers financial crimes and conspiracy. She can prosecute after the fact, but she can't prevent a murder at a public event using only federal investigators. She needs people who can be in the room in a way her office can't be. She needs your people. She needs a controlled environment. My people provide that. He met her eyes. And she needs you walking through the front door. As bait. As the trigger. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing. From where you're standing, you're the person who decides whether this ends or whether it continues. Whether the Volkovs get to finish what they started, or whether they walk into a room they think they've prepared and discover that every exit has already been sealed. His voice was low and direct, no performance in it. You said it yourself 3 days ago. We choose the ground, we walk in, and we finish it. Morel looked out the windshield at Crane's gray-coated figure still standing under the parking structure light, talking quietly into a phone. A woman who had been building a case in silence for 3 years, the same way Ada Vane had been building one in secret for 8 months. Women working in the spaces men didn't bother to watch carefully enough. Okay, Morel said. Tell me the plan. Ikumuke, Morel. The 13 days moved the way time moves before something irreversible. Too fast in the middle, agonizingly slow at the edges, and with a texture that felt different from ordinary time. More granular, more specific, each hour leaving fingerprints. Caius rebuilt with what Brennan hadn't reached. The assets buried deepest in his organization, people whose names existed in no document Brennan had ever accessed, contacts maintained through channels so indirect that they resembled coincidence more than structure, began surfacing. Not many. Enough. A skeleton of operational capacity assembled from the pieces that the betrayal had left behind. Soren coordinated security. 12 people positioned in and around the Hargrove Foundation Gala venue. The Ashford Grand, a hotel on the waterfront that hosted the event annually. Catering staff, maintenance personnel, 2 individuals registered as guests with legitimate invitations. Eyes in the room, hands available, communication running through encrypted channels that Crane's technical team had certified as clean. Crane's people handled the legal architecture. Morel's testimony was recorded in a federal facility on a Wednesday morning, 3 hours, a video recording, a sworn statement, and a written transcript simultaneously transmitted to 4 separate federal handlers in different jurisdictions. When it was done, Morel sat in a gray room under fluorescent light and felt simultaneously lighter and more terrified. The way you feel after you've done the thing you were afraid of and realize that the act of doing it has made you irreversible. Caius drove her back in silence. Halfway there, he reached across and put his hand over hers on the seat between them. She turned her palm up and held on. Neither of them spoke. The city moved past the windows. Harbor City in the days before the gala, carrying its corruption like a hidden wound. Politicians in their offices, officers in their precincts, a deputy commissioner behind a desk who didn't know yet that the ground beneath him was already falling. 3 days before the gala, the necklace broke again. The repaired clasp failed while Morel was pulling on a jacket, the chain slipping from her neck and falling to the floor of the safe house bedroom she'd been using. She picked it up and held the 2 ends in her fingers, the break clean and simple, a thing that could be fixed. She found Caius in the main room going over floor plans of the Ashford Grand with Soren. She set the necklace on the plans in front of him without a word. He looked at it, then at her. "Again," she said. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, warmer than that. He picked up the necklace and put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart, and went back to the floor plans. She stood there for a moment watching him. The architect of an empire bent over a map of a room where everything would either end or continue. A cheap necklace with a blue glass stone sitting in his pocket. She thought about the distance between those two things and decided the distance was the whole story. The night of the gala arrived gray and cold, with a thin rain that wasn't quite fog and wasn't quite mist, but something between them. A weather condition that muffled sound and softened the edges of the waterfront buildings until they looked like they were being remembered rather than seen. Morel stood in front of a mirror in a room at the hotel across the street from the Ashford Grand. Black velvet gown, borrowed, fitted by a woman Caius had sent, who spent 45 minutes working with pins and thread and the specific kind of focused silence that professionals use when the work matters. The butterfly stitches were gone. The cut above her eyebrow had healed to a thin pink line, still visible if you knew where to look. She'd covered the bruising on her collarbone with foundation applied with the same precision she used for everything now. She looked like someone who had survived something. Caius knocked and entered without waiting. He was in a black suit, dark enough to be severe, cut with the kind of precision that existed in a different universe from the borrowed clothes and mechanic's workshop blanket of the past 2 weeks. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes moved from her face to the healed cut to the necklace at her throat. He'd returned it repaired again silently, left it on her pillow the morning before, and something moved behind his eyes that he didn't try to conceal. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go." The Ashford Grand's ballroom was a cathedral of light. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling 3 stories up, scattering illumination in every direction until the room seemed to glow from the inside. White orchids on every table, a string quartet in the corner producing music that cost more per note than Morel's weekly salary. 500 people in evening wear, moving through the space with the specific choreography of Harbor City's elite. The ones who wrote checks, made calls, occupied the rooms where decisions about the city's future were made. And underneath it all, like a baseline too low to hear but present in every bone, the architecture that Caius had built. His people in the room. Eyes on every entrance. Crane's federal team positioned in vehicles outside, monitoring communications. The entire elaborate machinery of an ending, assembled in the spaces between the orchids and the champagne flutes. Morel walked in on Caius's arm and felt every eye in the room find them. Not all at once. In a wave, table by table, conversation by conversation, the recognition spreading outward from the entrance like a stone dropped in still water. Caius Vale at the Hargrove Foundation Gala. The Ghost King in a room full of the people who claimed not to know his name while cashing the checks that his operations made possible. Caius moved through the room with an ease that was either confidence or its perfect simulation. He spoke to 3 people in the first 10 minutes. Brief exchanges, names she didn't recognize, hands shaken with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that social performance was just another operational skill. Morel stayed close, smiled when she needed to, said little. She was scanning. Caius had briefed her for 4 hours the night before. Positions, signals, the specific movements that would indicate activation. Volkov operatives moving from social postures to operational ones. The subtle shift in body language that separated a man who was drinking champagne from a man who was about to reach inside his jacket. She counted 3 in the first 20 minutes. A man near the bar who ordered nothing and watched the room. 2 more near the service corridor entrance dressed as catering staff, their hands wrong. Not the hands of people who carried trays, but of people who carried other things. She touched Caius's arm twice. His signal confirmation back was a slight adjustment of his jacket, so minimal she would have missed it if she hadn't known to watch for it. He knew. He'd already counted them. They were 40 minutes into the event when Morel felt the shift. Not dramatic, not the way it felt in movies, no sudden cold air or raised hair on the back of her neck. Just a change in the room's energy, a subtle redistribution of attention that meant someone with significance had arrived. She looked toward the main entrance. Victor Embry, Deputy Commissioner of the Harbor City Police Department. 60 years old, silver-haired, with the red-faced confidence of a man who had never once sat in a room and doubted his own authority. He was in his formal dress uniform, the kind of appearance that announced institutional legitimacy, that used the costume of public service as camouflage for its opposite. He saw Caius immediately. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Embry's expression didn't change, which was in itself a kind of eloquence. The trained blankness of a corrupt man who had spent 20 years practicing the face that showed nothing. Caius smiled at him, small, specific. The smile of a man holding all the cards at a table the other man thought he owned. Embry looked away first. Morel felt Caius's hand press briefly against the small of her back. Not urgency, positioning. They moved together toward the center of the room, closer to the string quartet, further from the walls. The geometry of what Caius was doing resolved itself in her mind, moving them away from the perimeter, away from the service corridors, into the open center where visibility worked in their favor and angles worked against the shooters. Her earpiece, so small it was invisible from 3 feet away, placed by Soren that afternoon, clicked twice. Roman's voice, barely audible. "We have movement on the north balcony, 2 individuals, service credentials, not on the approved list." She didn't look up, didn't react, kept her eyes on the middle distance and her face at the setting that said elegant and present and entirely unconcerned. Caius leaned close to her ear. "Don't look at the balcony." "I know." In 40 seconds, move toward the east side of the room. "There's a pillar. Stay behind it until I signal." "And if you don't signal?" "I'll signal." She looked at him. His face was close enough that she could see the specific quality of his focus, the complete evacuation of everything personal from his expression, the pure predator clarity that had terrified her the first time she saw it, and now, in this moment, felt like the only solid thing in the room. "Don't get shot," she said. "Working on it," he said. She moved east. The first shot came from the north balcony. It hit the chandelier 2 feet above where she'd been standing, an explosion of crystal and light that rained down across the nearest tables and sent the first wave of screaming through the crowd. The second shot was lower, aimed at the crowd itself, and that was when the ballroom's careful social architecture collapsed completely. 500 people in evening wear became 500 people in terror. The geometry of panic is always the same. Outward from the impact toward any visible exit, bodies compressing into bottlenecks at doors and corridors. The string quartet abandoned their instruments. Tables overturned. Champagne and flowers and carefully arranged centerpieces hit the floor in a chaos of broken things. Morel pressed herself behind the pillar. Her heart was doing something that wasn't exactly beating. It was more like detonating, each contraction a small contained explosion that she felt in her throat and her fingertips and the soles of her feet. Through the crowd she caught fragments. Caius's men moving against the tide of fleeing guests, moving toward the threats the way water flows uphill when something forces it. Roman's voice in her ear, rapid and controlled. "North balcony neutralized. Repeat, north balcony clear. We have secondary contact in the east service corridor." A third shot hit the pillar 6 inches above her head. The impact threw chips of stone and plaster against her face. She ducked lower, hands over her head, the velvet gown pulling tight around her knees as she crouched. Her ears were ringing. The ballroom was smoke and screaming and the specific terrible percussion of a room being destroyed by professional violence. She looked around the pillar edge. The east service corridor door was open, 2 figures in catering uniforms moving through it with the body language of men who had stopped pretending. Weapons out. Moving fast. Moving toward the center of the room with a directional certainty that told her they weren't randomizing. They had a target, and they knew where it was. Her. The pillar was no longer cover. It was a position they already knew. Morel moved. She went left, staying low, using the overturned tables as cover, crawling in a black velvet gown across a ballroom floor littered with glass and spilled champagne and other people's abandoned shoes. Her taped feet screamed when she put weight on a shard wrong. She kept moving. Pain was information. It told you where not to step. It did not tell you to stop. She heard Caius before she saw him, his voice cutting through the noise, but not a shout, but a projection, carrying the specific authority of a man accustomed to being heard over chaos. "Morel! Left! Now!" She turned left. He was there, emerging from behind a toppled serving station, his jacket gone, the weapon in his right hand held down at his side with the practiced ease of a man for whom carrying it was as natural as breathing. There was a cut above his left eye, fresh, bleeding freely, tracking down the side of his face. He reached her in 4 steps, and his free hand closed around her arm, and they moved together toward the south exit, his body angled to keep himself between her and the room. The 2 operatives from the east corridor were 20 feet behind them. Caius turned and fired twice. Not pausing, not stopping, firing on the move with a fluency that belonged to years of practice in situations she didn't want to picture. 1 operative went down. The second took cover behind an overturned table and returned fire, the shot going wide, hitting the wall above the south exit doors. Then the doors opened from the other side, and Soren came through, followed by 2 more of Caius's men. The second operative looked up from behind the table and saw the math change and made a decision. Not bravery, not defiance, just the calculation of a professional recognizing a position that had become untenable. He ran. Soren's team went after him. Caius pulled Morel through the south exit into a service corridor. White walls, harsh fluorescent light. The smell of cleaning products and kitchen steam. The noise of the ballroom dropped behind them to a muffled roar. The corridor was empty except for a single figure at the far end. Morel stopped. Caius stopped. The figure was Denton Rourke. He looked wrong. Not drunk this time. Denton, completely sober, was a different kind of dangerous, stripped of the sloppiness that had made him survivable in a parking lot. He was wearing a catering uniform. His face had the focused, glassy quality of a man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was righteous. That was always the most dangerous kind of face. He was holding a weapon aimed directly at Morel. "Figured you'd come out this way," Denton said. His voice was steady, steadier than she'd ever heard it. "The Ghost King always retreats south. They told me that." Caius moved slightly to his left, angling his weapon up. Denton tracked the movement. "Don't!" Denton's aim stayed on Morel. "You move, she takes it first." Morel felt Caius go absolutely still beside her. She could feel the stillness in the air around him, the compressed energy of a man holding every instinct at bay through sheer disciplined will. "Denton," she said, "don't talk to me." "How much did they pay you?" "Enough." "Enough for what? Enough to end up the same way as every other person they've used and discarded?" She kept her voice even. She was shaking. She could feel the tremor in her hands, in her knees. But she kept her voice even, because the voice was all she had right now. "You're not walking out of this building, Denton, not because of him." She didn't look at Caius, but because the Volkovs don't leave witnesses. Not even hired ones, especially not hired ones. Something crossed Denton's face. A flicker, a crack in the glassy surface. "They'll come for you too," she said. "You're not an asset to them anymore. You're evidence." "Shut up. You know I'm right. You've always known when I'm right. That was the thing that made you angrier than anything else. Not that I lied, but that I didn't." The flicker again. Longer this time. She could see him thinking, the mechanism of it visible behind his eyes, and she kept talking because the moment he stopped thinking was the moment his finger moved. "Walk away," she said. "Right now. Turn around and walk out the back and disappear. Because what happens in the next 30 seconds in this corridor, whatever it is, you don't come back from it." Denton's weapon hand trembled, just slightly, a microquake running through the tendons of his forearm. Caius fired. The shot was placed with a surgical precision that would later make Morel understand completely and without abstraction why Harbor City was afraid of this man. It struck Denton's weapon hand, not the body, not the kill shot, the hand. And the weapon spun away and hit the wall and clattered to the floor, and Denton screamed and went sideways against the corridor wall, cradling his hand, his legs going out from under him. Caius was on him in 3 steps. He kicked the weapon down the corridor, out of reach, then stepped back and looked at Denton crumpled against the wall and said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. Denton was finished, and they both knew it. Roman's voice in the earpiece. "We need your position. South corridor. Crane's people are coming in through the east entrance. Federal agents on site. Everything is moving." Caius touched Morel's arm. "We have to move." She looked at Denton. He was holding his hand against his chest, his face white, his composure entirely gone. He looked like what he was, a small, damaged man who had made a series of terrible decisions. each one making the next one more likely, until he'd ended up in a service corridor in a catering uniform working for people who would have disposed of him like a receipt. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not relief. Something heavier. The specific weight of a narrative arriving at its conclusion. Not triumphant, just finished. Complete the way a wound is complete when it finally closes. She turned and walked with Caius toward the east entrance. The next hour was the opposite of the ballroom. Slow, where the ballroom had been fast. Procedural, where the ballroom had been chaos. Federal agents and windbreakers moving through the Ashford Grand with the controlled efficiency of people executing a plan that had been in preparation for 3 years. Embry in handcuffs in the lobby, his formal dress uniform stripped of its authority by the simple physical fact of his wrists being bound. 3 city council members escorted from the building by agents who used the same neutral expression for everyone. The machinery of law activated at last and running at full capacity. Crane found them in the east corridor. She looked at Caius first, the cut above his eye, the weapon still in his hand, and then at Morel in the destroyed velvet gown, and she said nothing about either. She was a woman who had learned to process the reality of situations without the distortion of commentary. "It's done," Crane said. "Embry?" Caius asked. "In custody. 3 of his network already in processing. The audio recording and the financial documentation were distributed to 6 federal nodes 40 minutes ago, before any of this started. There is no version of tonight in which the evidence doesn't survive." She paused. "Your people?" "1 injured. Superficial. Mine are all accounted for." She looked at him steadily. "We need to discuss terms." "Yes," Caius said. "We do. Not tonight." She looked at Morel. "Tonight you both need to be somewhere that isn't here." Morel's legs were beginning to register what her adrenaline had been preventing them from registering for the past hour. A deep structural exhaustion running from her calves to the base of her skull. The velvet gown had a long tear up the left side from crawling across the ballroom floor. Her feet, in the 2 delicate shoes she'd worn because they were what was available, were wet inside from something she chose not to examine under the fluorescent light. Caius noticed. He always noticed. He put his hand under her elbow, not grabbing, not controlling, just present, supporting. The difference was in the pressure, and she felt it. "Where's the exit?" she asked. "South loading dock," Crane said. "My people will take you out that way." Morel nodded. They walked. Caius's hand stayed at her elbow through the service corridor, past stainless steel kitchen equipment and idle catering carts, toward a set of heavy double doors at the end of the building. Behind them, she could hear the building continuing to process its event. Voices, footsteps, the formal language of authority being exercised. At the loading dock doors, Caius stopped. He turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders, gentle and specific. The cut above his eye had slowed to a dark track of dried blood along the side of his face. His suit was ruined. His eyes were the eyes of a man on the other side of something enormous, standing in the aftermath and trying to determine the shape of what came next. "Morel." "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say." His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "Then say it for me." She looked at him, the loading dock, the fluorescent light, the distant sounds of an empire being dismantled on the other side of a set of steel doors. Her mother somewhere in federal custody, waiting to be released. 13 days that had compressed a lifetime's worth of reckoning into a space that barely felt real. "You're going to say that this isn't finished," she said, "that Crane's terms, whatever they are, will take months to resolve, that the Volkov network doesn't collapse overnight, that there are still people who know my name and have reasons to use it." "Yes." "And you're going to say that you can't promise me safety. That proximity to you carries a cost that you know better than anyone." "Yes." "And you're going to say—" She stopped, looked at his face, at the cut, at the blood, at the absolute unperformed directness of his eyes. "You're going to ask me whether I want to walk out those doors with you or without you." The loading dock was cold. Outside, through the gap at the bottom of the doors, she could see the wet asphalt of the street and the orange wash of a streetlight and the thin rain still falling across Harbor City. An ordinary street, an ordinary night. The world continuing its business while something inside this building finished being what it was. Caius looked at her, his hands still on her shoulders, waiting with the patience of a man who had waited for years and understood that some answers couldn't be hurried. Behind them, the doors from the kitchen corridor opened and Roman appeared, his face carrying the particular expression of a professional, trying not to interrupt something he recognizes as more important than his timeline. "We need to move," Roman said. "Crane's vehicles are staged. If we're going—" "1 minute," Caius said, without looking away from Morel. Roman stepped back. Morel reached up and put her hand against Caius's jaw, her fingers against the dried blood on the side of his face. His skin was warm beneath the cold of the building, warm the way living things are warm. Not a metaphor, just the simple biological fact of a body that was still here, still functioning, still present in a night that had tried very hard to make it otherwise. She felt his pulse against her palm. She thought about Lena in a parking garage, about Ada at a kitchen table making pasta with 6 months of evidence hidden in her apartment, about a parking lot in the rain and a phone call and a voice that said, "Stay alive," with the force of an absolute command. She thought about 7 years of building a life designed to be small enough not to attract catastrophe. She thought about how the catastrophe had found her anyway, how it always does. "The problem," she said quietly, "is that I stopped being afraid of you somewhere between the parking lot and the burning building. And now I don't know what to do with that." Caius's thumb moved against her shoulder, the smallest possible movement. "I'm afraid of you," he said. "I have been since the day you walked out." "Afraid of what?" "That I'd finally fix everything I broke and you still wouldn't—" He stopped, set his jaw. "I'm not good at this." "I know. I can offer you a lot of things, Morel. Protection, resources, the specific kind of loyalty that doesn't require anything to be said because it's already demonstrated in the fact that I'm standing here." His voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it, stripped of the last layer of control. "But I can't offer you ordinary. I can't offer you safe. I can't offer you a life where nothing costs anything. That's not—" "I know what you can't offer," she said. "I've known for 7 years." "Then what do you—" She kissed him. Not desperate this time. Not the compressed terror of a car chase. Not the smoke and copper of a night on fire. This was something deliberate. She kissed him the way you sign your name to something, with full knowledge of what it means and the full weight of choosing it anyway. His hands moved from her shoulders to her face, cradling it with a care that was almost at odds with everything else about him. She felt the roughness of his hands and the warmth and the specific tension of a man trying not to hold on too tight because he was afraid of breaking the thing he'd been trying to get back for 7 years. When she pulled back, his eyes were closed for a moment. Then they opened. "With you," she said. "I walk out with you." Roman cleared his throat from the doorway. Caius lowered his hands, straightened his destroyed jacket with the reflexive precision of a man whose self-containment was so deeply habituated it operated even now, even here. He looked at her once more, that complete, unguarded look, lasting exactly 2 seconds before the operational mask settled back into place. He held out his hand. She took it. Roman pushed open the loading dock doors, and the cold harbor air hit them both, carrying the thin rain and the smell of salt water and the distant sounds of Harbor City processing another violent night in its long history of violent nights. Federal vehicles were staged along the street. Crane's people moved with quiet efficiency in the orange light. Somewhere to the north, sirens cycled through their frequencies. Caius led her toward the vehicles. His hand was tight around hers. And then the shot came. From above, from the hotel roof. A single report that cracked across the loading dock with a sound like the world splitting along a seam that had been under pressure for years. Caius lurched. The impact took him in the left side, below the ribs, spinning him half around. He caught himself against the side of the vehicle with his free hand, still holding Morel's with the other, still holding on, even now, even in the second after the bullet found him, the grip not loosening. Morel caught him. Her hands on his coat, his weight coming against her, and she felt the warmth of blood against her palm before she saw it, spreading through the dark fabric with a speed that turned her stomach to ice. "Caius, His breath came short. "Roof, there's someone on the—" Roman was already moving, weapon drawn, screaming into his radio. Crane's agents fanned outward. The night fractured into activity and shouting and the mechanical noise of a response being executed. But Morel was on her knees on the wet asphalt with Caius's head in her lap and her hands pressing against his side with everything she had. And the blood was warm between her fingers, and somewhere above them, on the roof of the Ashford Grand, a figure was moving through the rain toward the far edge with the deliberate pace of someone who had completed their assignment, and Morel looked up from Caius's face. His face that was still conscious, still present, still holding her with those eyes that had never, in all the years, stopped being the most terrifying and most honest thing she'd ever looked into. And she saw the figure on the roof, and she recognized the figure on the roof was Yuri Volkov. She knew it the way you know a thing that your body understood before your brain caught up. The shape of him, the deliberate stillness even in motion, the way he moved across the wet rooftop with the unhurried precision of a man who had decided that if this was the night everything ended, he would end it himself. No more intermediaries, no more hired hands who got their fingers shot off in service corridors, no more operatives who could be flipped or bought or frightened into running. Morel had never seen Volkov in person. She had seen his name in documents and heard it spoken in the specific tone people reserve for things that frighten them. She had understood him as a concept, the center of gravity around which everything terrible in the past 2 weeks had orbited. But now he was a man on a roof in the rain, and he was raising a weapon for a second shot, and Caius was bleeding in her lap. She pressed harder against the wound. "Roman." Her voice came out flat and functional, the way voices do when the body decides that emotion is a luxury that cannot currently be afforded. "Roof! He's still on the roof!" Roman was already moving. 2 of Crane's agents broke toward the hotel's exterior stairwell access. Soren materialized from somewhere in the staged vehicles and went with them, his face a mask of pure purpose. Caius's hand found her wrist. His grip was strong, stronger than she expected from a man losing blood on wet asphalt, and it pulled her attention down from the roof and back to his face. "Don't look up there," he said. His breath was shallow, but controlled. A man managing his own damage with the same discipline he applied to everything else. "You're bleeding." "I'm aware." A pause, a careful breath, measured at the ribs, testing the architecture. "It's not the lung. The angle was wrong for the lung." "You don't know that. I know where it hurts and where it doesn't." His eyes were sharp, present. Whatever else the bullet had done, it hadn't reached the thing behind his eyes that made him who he was. "Listen to me. Volkov came himself. That means there's nobody left to send. That means the network is already collapsing and he knows it. He came because this is the last move he has. That makes him more dangerous, not less." "Yes," Caius said. "It does." Above them, on the roof, the sound of running. Then shouting, Roman's voice, the flat commands of Crane's agents. Then a shot, and another. And then a silence that was different from the silence before the shots. More final. The silence that exists on the other side of a decision rather than before it. Morel kept both hands pressed against Caius's side and watched the roofline and breathed. A full minute passed. Roman appeared at the roof's edge and looked down. He found her face in the loading dock below. He gave a single nod. She felt something release in her chest, a pressure that had been building for 13 days, for longer than that, for years, decompressing in an instant like a held breath finally let go. Her hands were shaking against Caius's side. She realized she was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet, physiological overflow of a body that had been holding too much for too long and had reached its limit while she wasn't paying attention. Caius raised his free hand and pressed it over hers, adding pressure to the wound. "Hey," he said. "Don't." "Hey." His voice was gentler. "Look at me." She looked at him. "Still here," he said. "You got shot." "I've been shot before." "That's not—" She stopped, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, left a smear of blood on her cheek from her own hands. "That's not the reassurance you think it is." His eyes creased slightly at the corners, as close to a smile as Caius Vale got when someone had a bullet in him. "Crane's medics are in the second vehicle." She looked up. They were already moving, 2 paramedics with a kit, crossing the loading dock at a controlled pace that was faster than a walk and slower than a run. Professional urgency. Morel made herself let go of the wound so they could reach it. made herself stand up from the wet asphalt and step back and allow the people with the training and the equipment to do the thing she couldn't. It was one of the hardest physical acts of the night. Harder than crawling across a ballroom floor. Harder than pressing her hands against a man bleeding out. The act of stepping back and trusting something outside herself felt, in that moment, like the most demanding thing she'd ever done. She stood in the rain and watched them work. Crane appeared beside her. The federal investigator stood in the rain without commenting on it, watching her own team operate, her gray coat darkening at the shoulders. "Volkov?" Morel said. "In custody. He fired on my agents and was disarmed." A pause. "He's alive." "You need him alive?" "Yes. His testimony implicates elements of the network that the financial documentation only touches peripherally." Crane was looking at Caius as she spoke, watching the paramedics with the flat assessment of someone calculating assets and liabilities simultaneously. "Your testimony, combined with your mother's evidence and the audio recording, is sufficient to dismantle the Harbor City portion of the network. Volkov's cooperation, voluntary or otherwise, extends the case federally, to the supply chains, the import infrastructure, the political contacts in 3 other cities." "Well, answered Sabatuasan." Morel absorbed this. "So it's not over. It's over for you, for him." Crane paused. "The legal process continues for years. Prosecutions, trials, appeals. But the active threat to your safety, the operational directive to eliminate you as a witness, that ends tonight. With Volkov in custody and the network exposed, there's no organization left with both the motive and the capacity to reach you." Morel stood in the rain. The velvet gown was ruined. Her feet were wet and her hands were covered in someone she loved, and the loading dock smelled like exhaust and harbor water and the specific chemical scent of emergency medicine being deployed at speed. None of it felt like victory. It felt like the morning after. The gray, exhausted, quiet place on the other side of something enormous. "My mother," Morel said. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, if you want. I can arrange a meeting at the federal facility. The protective custody arrangement terminates at midnight tonight. She's free to go wherever she chooses after that. But I thought she might want somewhere safe to sleep first." Crane looked at her, a brief human look there and gone. "She asked about you, repeatedly, for 3 weeks." Morel said nothing. She pressed her lips together and looked at the sky above the loading dock, where the thin rain was beginning to ease and the clouds were fractionally lighter than they'd been an hour ago. The approaching edge of dawn, they took Caius to a private medical facility 40 minutes from the city. Not a hospital, a facility that Crane's office maintained for situations that required discretion, staffed by surgeons who understood that the intersection of law enforcement and organized crime sometimes produced patients whose existence in a standard emergency room would create complications. 2 operating rooms, 6 beds. The specific sterile silence of a place that existed entirely to keep difficult people alive long enough to become useful. Morel sat in a waiting room that was smaller and cleaner and significantly less comfortable than the ballroom she'd been in 2 hours earlier. She'd changed out of the destroyed gown into clothes that Soren had produced from the back of a vehicle. Sweatpants, a thermal shirt, a pair of sneakers that actually fit. She had wiped the blood from her hands at a sink in the hallway and watched the water run pink and thought about how many times, in the past 2 weeks, she had stood at a sink watching water carry blood away, and how she was not the same person at this sink that she'd been at the first one. Roman sat on the opposite side of the waiting room, not close enough to intrude, close enough to be present. He had a coffee he wasn't drinking, and his eyes were moving even in stillness, the permanent surveillance of a man whose profession was vigilance. Morel noticed, for the first time, that there was gray at his temples that she hadn't seen before. Or maybe she had, and hadn't registered it. It struck her that she had spent 2 weeks inside Roman's protection and knew almost nothing about him. "Do you have family?" she asked. He looked at her. The question seemed to recalibrate something in his expression. "A daughter," he said. 8 years old. "Where is she?" "With her mother, outside the city." A pause. "I go back on Sundays." Morel looked at her hands in her lap. Clean now. The knuckles still faintly raw from the parking lot 2 weeks ago, the healing nearly complete. "Does she know what you do?" "She knows I keep people safe." Roman turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She thinks it's like being a bodyguard for important people. That's not wrong. No, he said. It's not. They sat in the clean silence of the waiting room, while somewhere past a set of swinging doors, a surgeon worked on the man who had been rebuilt and dismantled and rebuilt again over 15 years of Harbor City's darkest operations, and who had ended up here, on a table in a room that didn't officially exist, because he'd knelt in a parking lot in the rain and brushed wet hair away from a bleeding woman's lip and made a decision that cost him everything he'd spent a decade constructing. The surgeon came out at 4:23 a.m. She was a compact woman with short gray hair and the demeanor of someone who had delivered news in both directions so many times that neither surprised her anymore. She looked at Morel first, not Roman Morel, which told Morel something about what Caius had said when they were preparing him. "The bullet is out," the surgeon said. "It missed the kidney by approximately 2 centimeters. There was significant muscle damage and blood loss, and he'll need 6 to 8 weeks of recovery to reach full function. But the structural damage is repairable, and there are no complications currently presenting." Morel breathed, just breathed. For a moment, that was the entire extent of what she was capable of. "Can I see him?" she said. "He's in recovery. He asked for you specifically," which was the first coherent thing he said after the anesthetic began clearing. The surgeon's expression was professionally neutral, but something at the corners of her eyes suggested that Caius Vale asking for someone specifically was not a thing she had encountered before. 10 minutes. He needs to sleep. The recovery room was dim and smelled like antiseptic and the specific chemical aftermath of surgery. Caius lay in a narrow bed with an IV line in his left arm and a monitor tracking his vitals in quiet green numbers. He was pale, paler than she'd ever seen him, the blood loss visible in the color of his skin, which had the faint waxen quality of a man whose body was redistributing its resources. But his eyes were open. Morel sat in the chair beside the bed. She leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and looked at him, and he looked back, and for a long moment neither of them said anything because the room was quiet and they were both still here, and that was, for now, sufficient. "You scared me," she said. "Seems fair," he said. His voice was rough from the anesthetic, lower than usual, stripped of the last layers of performance. "You've been scaring me for 7 years. That's different." "Is it?" She looked at his hand on the bed. She picked it up, held it between both of hers the way she'd held it in the SUV driving through Harbor City 2 weeks ago, when the convoy moved through the night like a funeral procession, and she didn't know yet how far the fall would go. "Crane said the threat is over," she said, "operationally. For now." She said for us specifically. "The active directive—" "I heard you." His thumb moved against her palm. Small, deliberate. "I'll verify it myself when I'm not currently recovering from a bullet. You're not going to just accept the assessment. I haven't survived this long by accepting assessments I haven't verified." She almost smiled. Almost. "The immunity arrangement, the federal one, you said it might be possible. Crane and I have things to discuss. She wants your cooperation on the extended network, the other cities. I know what she wants. Will you give it to her?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling, the green numbers on the monitor tracking his heartbeat with a patience that the machine didn't know was patience, but felt like it. "There are people in my organization who acted in good faith, who worked inside a structure they inherited and did what was asked of them without knowing the full architecture of what they were part of." His jaw worked. "Any arrangement I make needs to protect those people from prosecution. That's your condition, that's my condition." She held his hand and thought about what it meant to love someone whose entire life had been built in the dark. To love the man and account for what the man had done, and find that the accounting didn't end in simple judgment, but in something more complicated and more honest. She had been trying to separate Caius from his world for 7 years, trying to love the person while refusing the context. And it had never worked because the person and the context were not separable. He was who he was because of what he'd survived, and what he'd survived had produced, along with all the damage and the blood and the machinery of violence, the man who memorized how she took her coffee and slept outside her door and fixed a $12 necklace twice. You didn't love the version of someone that existed in the absence of their history. You loved the whole weight of them, or you didn't. "Sleep," she said. He closed his eyes. His grip on her hand didn't loosen. She sat there until his breathing steadied and deepened and the green numbers settled into the rhythm of genuine sleep. Then she carefully freed her hand and covered his with the thin hospital blanket and walked out of the recovery room into the corridor where the lights were slightly brighter and Roman was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "He'll be all right," she said. Roman nodded once. Something moved in his face that wasn't his professional expression. "Good," he said, just the one word. But it carried the weight of a man who had been inside Caius Vale's orbit for years and understood, without being able to put it in terms that would survive examination, that this particular outcome mattered. Dawn was fully established by the time they drove back toward the city. The thin rain had stopped. Harbor City emerged from the dark in increments. The waterfront first, then the mid-rise buildings of the financial district, then the tighter geometry of the residential neighborhood spreading inland. A city that looked, in the early gray light, exactly like what it was, a place made of accumulated decisions, some terrible and some not, all of them layering onto each other until the result was this: streets and buildings, and the specific human density of a place where people had decided to live their lives in proximity to each other, for better or worse. Morel asked Roman to stop 2 blocks from Blackwater Diner. "I just want to see it," she said. He pulled to the curb without asking why. She got out. The street was empty at this hour. A Tuesday morning, not yet awake, the storefronts shuttered, a single delivery truck idling at the far end of the block. The diner's sign buzzed in the early morning, half the letters still dead, the remaining ones casting their sick pink glow across the empty sidewalk. Through the window she could see the interior, the booths she'd cleaned 1,000 times, the counter where she'd stood for 10 hours at a stretch, the clock above the register that had told her when she was free to leave, booth 9. She looked at it through the glass, a vinyl bench and a formica table and a view of the street that Caius had occupied while watching a storm and waiting for something to be over or something to begin. She still wasn't entirely sure which. She stood on the sidewalk in the early morning light and looked at the diner and understood that she would not be coming back. Not as an employee. Not as the woman who had built her life small enough to stay invisible. That version of her life. The careful, minimal, self-protective life she'd constructed to prove that she could survive on her own terms had served its purpose. It had kept her alive long enough to get to the other side of something she hadn't known was coming. But you don't carry scaffolding into the building after construction is done. She got back in the car. Ada Vane was staying at the federal facility in a room that was clean and comfortable and had a window that faced east. When Morel came through the door at 8 a.m., her mother was sitting at a small table with a cup of coffee and her hands wrapped around it the way she'd always held coffee. Both hands, fingers interlaced, like she was keeping it warm or it was keeping her. She was 61 years old and looked, in this moment, every year of it. The past 3 weeks had done something to her face. Not aged it exactly, but clarified it. Removed something soft and replaced it with the sharper thing underneath. She stood when she saw Morel. They stood on opposite sides of the small room for 2 full seconds, the specific suspended moment before 2 people who have been separated by circumstances larger than either of them makes the decision about how to close the distance. Morel crossed it. Her mother held on with the grip of a woman who had spent 3 weeks in a safe room, imagining every version of this not happening. Morel felt the familiar shape of her, the specific way Ada Vane's arms went around her daughter, the smell of her hair, the sound of her breathing, which was ragged for a moment and then steadied. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When they separated, both of them were wet-faced and neither acknowledged it. Ada sat back down. Morel pulled the other chair around and sat close, their knees almost touching. "You should have told me," Morel said. Not with anger, with the simple directness of someone stating a fact that both parties already knew. "I know. 8 weeks, Mom. I know." Ada's hands went back around the coffee cup. "Every week I told myself it's next week, when I have something more concrete, when I know it's enough to protect you. And then Crane told me that contact would compromise the investigation, that the Volkov network had surveillance on you and any meeting between us could flag the cooperation." She looked at Morel. "I wasn't protecting myself. I want you to know that. I was trying to build something big enough to actually fix it, not just report it. Fix it. You copied 6 months of financial records, 18 months. And the recording. Ada's expression shifted. Something very quiet and very hard moved behind her eyes. That meeting was the worst thing I have ever done in my life. Sitting in a room with that man, letting him talk, keeping my face still. She paused. But I knew what I had when I walked out. I knew it was enough. Morel looked at her mother. At the ordinary woman who made pasta and worried about rent and had sat across from Yuri Volkov with a recording device and kept her face still. People contain so many contradictions, the most ordinary surfaces concealing the most extraordinary capacities. You think you know someone completely, and then the world puts pressure on them in the right place, and something comes through that you never imagined was there. Caius was shot, Morel said. He's going to be all right, but I wanted you to know. Ada was quiet for a moment. She had opinions about Caius Valley. Morel knew she did, could feel them in the careful way her mother's expression arranged itself when the name was introduced. But she said, I'm glad he's all right. And it was true. Whatever else Ada Vane thought, she had spent 3 weeks inside a federal investigation that had watched Caius's people function as the only operational barrier between her daughter and people who wanted her dead. The opinions were still there, but they had been complicated. What happens now? Ada asked. For you. You're free as of midnight. You can go home. Crane says the network is effectively dismantled at the operational level. The legal process runs for years, but the active danger is done. And you? Morel looked at the east-facing window. The light coming through it was the specific quality of full morning now. Not the flat gray of dawn, but something warmer, with actual color in it. Harbor City light, on a morning that had arrived despite everything that had tried to prevent it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I need to figure out what comes next, what I want, who I am, when I'm not surviving something. Ada looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she reached across the small table and put her hand over Morel's. The same gesture Morel had made in Caius's hospital room, one generation to the next. The same language of holding on. You were always more than what you were surviving, Ada said, even when you couldn't see it. Morel turned her hand over and held on. 3 weeks passed in the specific quiet of aftermath. Not peaceful. Aftermath is never peaceful. It's just a different kind of noise, lower frequency, less immediate, but constant. The legal machinery moved. Embry was arraigned on 17 counts. 2 city council members entered plea negotiations. The harbor commissioner resigned. Victor Embry's attorney released a statement that was immediately dismantled by the evidence record. Yuri Volkov, in federal custody and facing charges in 3 jurisdictions, began a cooperation process with federal prosecutors that would eventually take 2 years to complete. The structure he had built in Harbor City dissolved the way structures built on purchased loyalty always dissolve. Quickly, completely, each component abandoning the next as the incentives evaporated. Caius recovered in a private facility with the determined stubbornness of a man who considered being injured an administrative problem to be resolved. The surgeon's 8-week timeline became 6. By week 4, he was walking the facility's perimeter twice daily, much to his medical team's poorly concealed frustration. By week 5, he was on the phone with Crane's office for 2 hours a day. Morel visited on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Not every day. She was deliberate about that. She had her own things to do, her own threads to pick up and examine and decide what to keep. She went back to her apartment on Fenwick Street and stood in the living room for a long time, looking at the evidence of her previous life. The tip jar on the counter, the bus schedules pinned to the board by the door, the second-hand furniture she'd accumulated over 4 years of careful, minimal living. She packed 2 boxes and left the rest for donation and gave her landlord 30 days' notice. She enrolled in a paralegal certification program she'd been looking at for 2 years and never had the stability to commit to. She had the conversation with Ray at Blackwater Diner, brief, factual, respectful, and turned in her apron. She found an apartment 3 miles from Ada's house that had a bathroom ceiling without a leak and a front door lock that worked on the first try. She built something new, slowly, from the pieces that were hers. On a Thursday in the 6th week, she arrived at the facility to find Caius in the courtyard, standing, walking without visible pain, wearing a dark sweater and looking at the sky with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he had been forced to view from a horizontal position for longer than he found acceptable. He turned when he heard her. She stopped a few feet away, looked at him. standing and whole and carrying the specific quality of a man who had been broken open and imperfectly reassembled and was somehow better for the imperfection. The scar from the bullet wound would be permanent. She knew that. She'd seen it when his shirt rode up during one of her visits, a thick purple line below his ribs that would be there for the rest of his life. "You look better," she said. "I feel functional." He studied her face. The careful look he gave everything, reading information that other people missed. "You cut your hair." She had. 2 inches. A decision made alone in a bathroom on a Wednesday morning that had felt, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, like a small piece of reclamation. "I did." "It suits you." They walked the perimeter of the courtyard, side by side, not touching, the late afternoon light coming at a low angle through the bare trees. November had arrived while they weren't paying attention, the way November always does. The leaves gone, the air specific and cold. The sky, the particular blue that only exists in autumn when the humidity finally drains from the atmosphere. "Crane's terms," Kaya said. "They're finalized." She looked at him. "And?" "My cooperation on the extended network, names, routes, financial structures, contacts in 4 cities, in exchange for a federal immunity agreement covering the operational activities of my Harbor City organization. Individuals at the lower levels of the structure are excluded from prosecution unless independently implicated. The arrangement includes the dismantling of the remaining operational infrastructure over a 12-month period under federal supervision." He was precise, as always, when discussing mechanics, but beneath the precision, she could hear something else. A man at the end of a very long road, looking at what the road had cost and deciding whether the destination justified the toll. "After that, I'm out. Out. Out." She absorbed this. The word carried so much weight, 15 years of weight, built up one decision at a time in the dark architecture of Harbor City's underworld, now set down. "What do you do after out?" "I don't know yet." He glanced at her sideways, the almost smile. "That's a new experience." Not knowing what's next. Not knowing and finding it acceptable. They completed the courtyard loop in silence. At the end of it, near the door back into the facility, Kaya stopped. He turned to face her fully, the low autumn light catching the edge of his jaw, the gray that had come into his temples during the past weeks, the specific quality of his eyes that she had given up trying to describe accurately to herself and simply accepted as what they were, the truest thing about him, the place where the machinery and the person intersected and neither entirely one. He reached into his pocket. The necklace. The silver chain with the blue glass stone. He held it out on his palm, the clasp repaired for the 3rd time. The chain caught the light and scattered it in small, cold points. "This keeps breaking," she said. "So do a lot of things worth keeping." She stood there looking at it. A $12 piece of costume jewelry that had been broken and fixed and broken and fixed, and now rested in the palm of a man who had dismantled an empire and survived a bullet and made himself, piece by piece, into something she had not expected and could not walk away from. She took it from his palm, reached up and fastened it around her own neck. The clasp held. She looked at him. He looked at her. The courtyard was quiet, and the light was the specific gold of late afternoon, and somewhere in the facility behind them, the machinery of a future was assembling itself out of the materials that the past had left behind. "There's something I need to ask you," she said. "Ask. When this is done, when the 12 months is done and the dismantling is finished and you're out, what are you left with?" He held her gaze. This question was a real one, not rhetorical. She watched him receive it and examine it with the same precision he examined everything. "What I started with," he said finally, "before any of it." A pause. "And whatever you decide I get to build next." The "and whatever" was the whole sentence. Everything else was preface. Morel looked at him for a long moment. The man who had once loved her hard enough to let her go. Who had watched from a distance for 7 years because he believed his proximity was a death sentence. Who had gotten it wrong and gotten it right in equal measure, and was standing in a courtyard in November with a bullet scar below his ribs, offering her the only honest thing he had, the future, contingent and unguaranteed in its entirety. She understood that this was what it looked like in real life. Not the clean arc of a story resolving itself into certainty, but the specific, imperfect, irreducible truth of two people who had survived something together and were standing on the other side of it, choosing, with full knowledge of everything it cost and everything it might still cost, to stay. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Don't make me regret it." "I'll try." The almost smile again. More than almost this time. "That's all I can give you, the trying." "That's all anyone can give anyone," she said. She turned and walked back toward the facility door. After a moment, he fell into step beside her, their shoulders not quite touching. The specific proximity of two people who had learned the difference between need and choice and were, at last, choosing. 7 weeks later, Mirelle stood on the sidewalk outside Blackwater Diner for the last time. She had been asked to return once, not to work, but to give a final statement to Crane's investigators about the Tuesday night exchange she had witnessed, the one that had started everything. She'd done it in the diner itself, at the back booth, sitting in the same seat where the two men in suits had left a $50 bill beside untouched coffee, while a federal recorder captured her account of an ordinary moment that had turned out to be the load-bearing wall of an entire criminal architecture. Afterward, she stepped outside into the first real snow of the year. It fell in the particular way of early winter snow, large, deliberate flakes that moved through the streetlight glow like slow static, accumulating on the cold pavement with a silence that felt intentional. The diner's sign buzzed above her, half the letters dead. The living ones still casting their pink light across the sidewalk where she had bled, where she had called a number she was never supposed to call, where everything had started. A car was parked at the curb, black, clean, the engine running, exhaust rising in the cold air. Caius leaned against the hood with his hands in the pockets of a dark wool coat, watching the snow fall with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he found worth watching. He looked like himself, fully himself. Not the recovery version or the operational version, or the version stripped bare by blood and crisis and the specific vulnerability of being shot in a loading dock and held by someone whose hands he'd been trying to protect for 7 years. Just the man. The actual one. He saw her come out. He didn't move toward her. He waited, the way he always waited, with the patience of someone who understood that some distances have to be crossed by the person who chooses to cross them. She walked toward him. The snow fell around her. It was cold enough to see her breath. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her without speaking for a moment, his eyes going to the necklace at her throat, visible above her collar, the blue glass stone catching the pink light from the sign above them. The clasp was holding. "Are you still dangerous?" she asked. He opened the passenger door. "For everyone except you," he said. She looked at him for one more moment, the man, the history, the cost, the choice, and then she got in. The door closed. The car pulled away from the curb and moved through Harbor City's first snow, the streets empty and white and clean in a way they hadn't been in years, the weight of what the city had been slowly dissolving under the accumulation of something quiet and ordinary and new. Streetlights moved past. The waterfront. The mid-rise buildings. The neighborhoods where people were asleep in their beds, living their lives, carrying their own weights through their own darknesses. The car turned north. The city fell away behind them. The snow kept falling.